Hello and welcome. I hope you all enjoy tonight's cryptid horror stories. The oil in the lamp. The floor of the kitchen was made of poured concrete that had been polished smooth by decades of bare feet and diligent scrubbing, and Ajoa was working it with a mixture of bleach and palm oil, the way her mother had taught her, the way her mother's mother had taught before that, a recipe that was older than the village itself, and that served purposes both practical and spiritual. The bleach killed the bacteria that thrived in the humid air of the rainforest edge, and the palm oil nourished the concrete, filling the microscopic pores with a sheen that repelled water and reflected light in a way that made the kitchen seem brighter than it was, warmer than the bare walls and thatched roof should have allowed. Ajoa hummed as she worked, a song her grandmother had sung, a lullaby in Twi that spoke of the river and the forest and the spirits that lived in the spaces between the trees, and her infant son, Quame, lay in a basket of woven reeds nearby, gurgling and waving his fists at the mosquitoes that orbited his head like planets around a sun. She did not notice the spark at first. It was small, no larger than a firefly, but it did not flicker or pulse with the bioluminescent rhythm of an insect. It sat perfectly still on her shoulder, a brilliant emerald green, its light steady and unwavering, and it did not fly away when she moved, did not react when she brushed at it absent-mindedly with her free hand. It simply listened, absorbed the sound of her humming, the warmth of her body, the scent of the bleach and palm oil that rose from the floor in a miasma that was simultaneously caustic and sweet. It listened, and it learned, and it waited for the moment when the house would be ready, when the conditions would be right, when the invitation that Ajoa did not know she was extending would become explicit and irrevocable. Ama Osai had not seen her grandmother's house in 15 years, not since she had left the village at 19 to study nursing in Accra, not since she had married a man she met in the city, and divorced him 3 years later when she discovered that his ambition was a mask for cruelty, not since she had given birth to Maya and decided, in the sleepless months that followed, that she would raise her daughter differently than she had been raised, without superstition, without the weight of ancestral obligation, without the constant whispered warnings about windows and salt, and the things that came in the night when the lamps burned low. She was a modern woman, a skeptic, a believer in science and medicine and the demonstrable facts of a world that could be measured and tested and understood. She had no patience for the stories her grandmother had told her, the tales of the Ads and the Sasabonsum and the dwarfs that lived in the silk cotton trees, and she had viewed her grandmother's final years with a mixture of pity and frustration, watching the old woman seal her windows with salt, keep bowls of coconut water by every door, and mutter prayers that sounded more like bargains with unseen forces than conversations with the Christian God she claimed to worship. But death had a way of collapsing the distance between skepticism and tradition, and when the lawyer's letter arrived in Accra, informing Amma that her grandmother had passed, and that the house and the small plot of land it stood upon were now hers to dispose of as she saw fit, she had felt a pull that she could not explain rationally, a gravitational force that drew her back to the village she had fled, back to the house where she had spent her childhood summers, back to the world of salt and coconut water, and the heavy, humid darkness that fell over the rainforest like a blanket every evening at 6. She told herself that she was going to sell the property to settle the estate, to make a clean break with the past that had produced her, and then tried in its own way to consume her. But she knew, in the part of her mind that she did not share with her urban friends and colleagues, that there was more to the journey than pragmatism. There was guilt for having abandoned her grandmother in her final years. There was curiosity for having never fully understood the old woman's beliefs. And there was fear, a primitive, atavistic dread that she could not name and would not acknowledge, a sense that the house was not merely a building but a threshold, a boundary between the world she understood and a world she had spent her adult life trying to convince herself did not exist. Maya was 6 years old, a city child with a city child's assumptions about the world. That water came from taps, that light came from switches, that monsters were imaginary creatures invented by adults to control behavior. She had never seen a firefly, never heard the call of a nightjar, never felt the particular terror of a darkness so complete that it seemed to have weight and texture and intention. She was excited about the trip, not because of the house or the village or the grandmother she had never met, but because of the airplane, because of the possibility of seeing monkeys, because of the adventure that her mother's serious face seemed to promise without promising. She packed her own small suitcase, filling it with books and dolls and the electronic tablet that Amma had given her for her 6th birthday, and she sat on the plane with her face pressed against the window, watching the landscape change from the concrete and glass of Accra to the green infinity of the rainforest. And she asked questions that Amma could not answer, about the shapes of the clouds and the colors of the rivers, and the meaning of the songs that the flight attendants sang as they served drinks and snacks. They arrived at the village in the late afternoon, when the sun was already sinking toward the tree line, and the shadows were stretching long and liquid across the red dirt roads. The house stood at the edge of the settlement, separated from the other dwellings by 100 meters of cocoa plantation that had been left to run wild after Amma's grandfather's death. The trees grown into a tangle of branches and vines that formed a natural barrier between the house and the village proper. It was a traditional building, rectangular with a pitched roof of corrugated iron over a thatch underlay. The walls made of laterite blocks plastered with mud and painted a faded ochre that had once been bright. The windows were small and high, designed for defense as much as ventilation, and the door was mahogany, heavy and ornately carved with patterns that Amma recognized from her childhood. Interlocking geometric shapes that her grandmother had said were protective symbols, though Amma had always suspected they were merely decorative, the product of a carpenter's aesthetic rather than a shaman's intent. The interior smelled of her grandmother, of the particular combination of spices and herbs and old cloth and wood smoke that had defined Amma's earliest memories. The furniture was simple, functional, unchanged since her childhood. A table and chairs in the main room, a sleeping platform in the back, a kitchen area with a charcoal stove and clay pots, and the iron laundry basin that her grandmother had used for everything from washing clothes to preparing ritual baths. There were no electric lights, only oil lamps and candles, and the water came from a rainwater cistern rather than a municipal pipe. It was primitive by city standards, but it was clean and dry and structurally sound, and Amma found herself relaxing into the familiarity of it despite her determination to maintain professional distance from the sentimentality of nostalgia. Maya explored the house with the boundless energy of a child released from the confines of an airplane, poking into corners and cupboards, exclaiming over the discovery of a machete hanging on the wall, a basket of dried herbs, a clay figurine that Amma remembered her grandmother calling a fertility doll, but that Maya declared was a tiny person made of dirt. Amma let her explore, knowing that the house was safe, that there were no real dangers lurking in the corners, that her grandmother's precautions had been the products of an old woman's declining mind rather than responses to actual threats. She unpacked their bags, arranged their sleeping mats on the platform, and set about preparing a meal from the supplies she had brought from the city. Rice, tinned fish, packets of seasoning that seemed suddenly garish and artificial in the context of the kitchen's earth-toned simplicity. It was after dark, after the meal had been eaten and the dishes washed, and Maya had fallen asleep on the sleeping platform with her tablet still clutched in her hand, that Amma noticed the fireflies. She had opened the windows to air out the house, ignoring her grandmother's habit of keeping them sealed after sunset, and the night air flowed in, cool and scented with frangipani and something else, something musky and organic that Amma could not identify. And with the air came the insects, not in a swarm but in a procession, a deliberate and organized entry that seemed more like a visitation than an infestation. They were fireflies, or something that looked like fireflies, their bodies emitting a pale green light that pulsed with a rhythm that suggested communication, coordination, purpose. They did not fly randomly around the room, banging against walls and ceilings as insects normally did. They congregated around the cracks in the mahogany door, around the gaps in the thatched roof, around the spaces where the window frames did not quite meet the walls. They gathered at the boundaries, the thresholds, the places where the inside met the outside, and they stayed there, pulsing, waiting, as though they were guards posted at the entrances to a fortress, or scouts assessing the defenses of an enemy encampment. Amma watched them for a long time, her skepticism warring with a growing unease that she could not rationalize. Fireflies were common in the rainforest, she told herself. They were attracted to light and warmth and moisture, and the house offered all three. Their behavior was unusual but not supernatural, a response to environmental conditions that her urban-trained mind simply did not understand. She did not reach for the salt that her grandmother had kept in clay jars by every window. She did not close the shutters or whisper the prayers that she had learned in childhood and then rejected as adult. She simply watched and waited, and eventually she fell asleep on the sleeping platform beside her daughter, lulled by the rhythmic pulsing of the insects and the familiar weight of humidity in her lungs. She woke once in the night, or thought she woke, to find Maya sitting upright on the mat, her eyes open but unfocused, her body rigid, staring at the wall where a single firefly, larger than the others, its light steady rather than pulsing, hovered at the level of her face. "Maya," Amma whispered, reaching out to touch her daughter's shoulder, and the child turned to her with eyes that were not entirely her own, eyes that seemed to look through Amma at something beyond her, something that existed in a dimension adjacent to the normal world. "They're singing, Mama," Maya said, her voice distant and dreamy, not the voice of a 6-year-old but the voice of someone much older, someone who had heard songs that humans were not meant to hear. "The lights are singing, and they want me to sing back." Amma gathered Maya in her arms, holding her tight, feeling the child's heartbeat rapid and fluttering against her chest, and she whispered urban comforts, scientific reassurances, the language of a mother who knew that nightmares were temporary and that morning would bring clarity and normality. She did not see the firefly land on Maya's lip, did not see the child's mouth open slightly as though to receive communion, did not see the insect's body pulse once with a light that was brighter than before, as though it had tasted something, learned something, confirmed something that it had suspected since it first entered the house. In the morning, Maya remembered nothing. She woke cheerful and hungry, demanding breakfast and chattering about the monkeys she hoped to see in the cocoa plantation. Amma examined her carefully, looking for signs of illness, of fever, of the parasitic infections that were common in rural Ghana, and that her nursing training had taught her to recognize and treat. She found nothing except a few small marks on the child's neck and wrists, pinprick bruises that she dismissed as mosquito bites or the result of scratching in her sleep. She applied calamine lotion and reminded herself to buy mosquito netting in the village market, and she put the night behind her as a bad dream, a product of travel fatigue and the unfamiliar environment, nothing more. But the fireflies returned the next night, and the next, and each night they were more numerous, more organized, more focused in their attention on the sleeping platform where Amma and Maya lay. They did not enter the room in the sense of flying around and exploring the space. They remained at the boundaries, at the cracks and gaps and thresholds, and they pulsed in unison, a green heartbeat that filled the darkness with a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with Amma's own pulse, with Maya's breathing, with the creak of the house settling and the distant calls of night birds in the plantation. And each morning, Amma found new marks on Maya's skin, not just on the neck and wrists but on the inner thighs, the backs of the knees, the soft skin behind the ears, places that mosquitoes did not typically bite, places that suggested not random feeding but systematic exploration, mapping, tasting. The fever began on the 4th night. Maya woke screaming, her body burning with a heat that Amma recognized as dangerously high, her skin flushed and dry, her eyes rolling back in her head. Amma used the techniques she had learned in nursing school: cool compresses, hydration, antipyretic medication from the first aid kit she had brought from the city. The fever did not break. It fluctuated, rising and falling in waves that did not correspond to any pattern Amma recognized, not the steady progression of bacterial infection, not the cyclical spikes of malaria, not the sudden onset of viral illness. It was as though Maya's body were fighting something that did not belong to any category of known pathogen, something that attacked not the cells but the vitality itself, draining not blood but energy, leaving the child lethargic and pale and confused. Unable to focus her eyes, unable to form coherent sentences, unable to do anything but lie on the sleeping platform and stare at the ceiling where the fireflies gathered in greater numbers each night, their green light pulsing in rhythm with the child's labored breathing. Amma wanted to take her to the hospital in Accra, to the modern medical facility where tests could be run and diagnoses made and treatments administered according to evidence-based protocols. But the village was 3 hours from the nearest paved road, and the road was impassable in the rainy season, and Maya was too weak to travel, and Amma was too afraid to leave the house, though she could not have said what she was afraid of, could not have named the dread that settled over her like a shroud each evening when the sun went down and the fireflies began their vigil at the thresholds. She consulted with the village elders, old women who came to the house with baskets of fruit and sympathetic clucking, who examined Maya with knowing eyes and shook their heads and spoke in proverbs that Amma had forgotten or never learned. "The child has been touched by the ads," one of them said, a woman named Nana Afia who had known Amma's grandmother since childhood and who spoke with the authority of someone who had seen things that could not be explained by medicine or science. "The fireflies are not insects. They are eyes. They are the windows through which the ads watches, waits, hungers. Your grandmother kept the house sealed. She kept the salt at the windows and the coconut water by the doors, and she never opened the shutters after dark, never invited the night inside. But you have opened the windows. You have let the air in, and with the air the ads has entered. Not fully, not yet, but it is tasting, it is testing, and when it finds the child sweet enough it will take her." Amma listened to these words with the same skepticism she had applied to her grandmother's mutterings. But beneath the skepticism ran a current of fear that was older than rationality, deeper than education, a primal terror that recognized the truth in Nana Afia's warnings, even as her conscious mind rejected them as superstition. She asked what she should do, what medicine she should give, what ritual she should perform to drive the ads away, and Nana Afia looked at her with eyes that were sad and knowing and utterly without hope. "You cannot drive away what you have invited in," she said. "You can only close the door and hope that the ads will leave of its own accord, but it will not leave while the child is sweet. It will not leave while there is palm oil in the house, while there is coconut water, while there is the scent of the offerings that your grandmother kept ready. The ads feeds on these things, on the oil and the water and the vitality of the young, and your grandmother knew this, and she maintained the balance, and the ads was content to take small sips rather than large gulps. But you have disturbed the balance. You have opened the windows, and now the ads is hungry." Amma wanted to argue, to explain that fireflies did not drink palm oil, that insects did not plot and scheme and bargain, that the marks on Maya's skin were not the work of a supernatural parasite, but of some unknown biological agent that modern medicine had not yet catalogued. But the words stuck in her throat, because she had seen the fireflies, had watched their organized behavior, had felt the weight of their attention pressing against her like a physical force. And she knew, in the part of her mind that was still connected to the village and the forest and the darkness between the trees, that Nana Afia was speaking a truth that could not be refuted by science, because it operated on principles that science had not yet learned to measure. She spent the afternoon sealing the house. She found the clay jars of salt that her grandmother had kept in the kitchen, the coarse gray salt that came from the coast and that was said to have purifying properties, and she sprinkled it along the windowsills and the door frames and the gaps in the floorboards where the fireflies had been congregating. She found the bowls of coconut water, stale and evaporated but still present, and she refreshed them from the cistern, placing them by every entrance as her grandmother had done. She closed the shutters and barred the door and lit the oil lamps that had been her grandmother's only source of illumination, filling the house with a warm yellow light that seemed to push back the darkness in a way that the electric flashlight she had brought from the city could not. And she sat by Maya's side, holding her daughter's hand, feeling the fluttering pulse that was too fast and too weak, watching the child's chest rise and fall with breaths that were shallow and uneven. And she prayed, not to the god of her urban church but to the older gods, the gods of the forest and the river and the spaces between the trees, the gods that her grandmother had served and that Amma had abandoned, and that she now, in her desperation, was willing to acknowledge if they would only save her child. The fireflies did not leave. They remained at the thresholds, pulsing, waiting, and Amma understood that the salt and the coconut water were not enough, that the door had been opened and could not be closed by mere ritual, that the ads had been invited and would not depart until it had taken what it came for, or until it was driven out by a force stronger than salt and water and prayer. She sat in the darkness, in the lamplight, in the humid silence of the house that had been her grandmother's and was now hers, and she listened to the firefly's pulse, and she felt the weight of the darkness press against the walls, and she knew that the night would be long, and that the morning might not come, and that the balance her grandmother had maintained for decades was gone, shattered by her own arrogance, her own skepticism, her own refusal to believe in the things that she could not see until they were looking at her with eyes that glowed green in the darkness and hungry in a way that no insect should be. The morning after Amma sealed the house, she woke to find that the fireflies had not gone but had changed their strategy. Instead of congregating at the thresholds, they had found new entry points, microscopic gaps in the thatch where the palm fibers had decayed, spaces between the corrugated iron and the wooden beams where rust had eaten through the metal, the chimney flue that opened to the sky and admitted not smoke but light, green and pulsing and patient. They filled the house not as a swarm but as a haze, a luminous fog that reduced visibility to arm's length and transformed the familiar rooms into alien landscapes where the furniture loomed like monoliths and the walls receded into infinity. Amma woke to find Maya still feverish, still breathing in those shallow, uneven gasps, but now the child's skin was not merely pale but translucent, the veins visible beneath the surface like blue rivers on a map, and the pinprick bruises had multiplied, spreading across her chest and abdomen in patterns that suggested not random injury but deliberate marking, as though something were drawing a chart on the child's body, mapping the courses of her veins, identifying the places where the vitality was richest, where the life force flowed strongest and sweetest. She checked the pantry first, because the hunger had awakened her, a sound in the night that she had attributed to rats or wind, but that, in the green light of morning, revealed itself as something else entirely. The pantry was a small room off the kitchen, built of the same laterite blocks as the rest of the house, with shelves of rough-hewn wood that held the supplies her grandmother had accumulated. Bags of dried beans, bottles of palm oil sealed with wax, jars of ground nuts, bundles of dried fish, clay pots of shea butter, and the casks of coconut water that her grandmother had collected from the village market every Tuesday, religiously, as though the survival of the household depended on maintaining a specific level of hydration for forces that did not drink water in the conventional sense. The pantry had been raided, not by rats, which would have left teeth marks and droppings and scattered debris, not by thieves, who would have taken valuables and left the rest. The raid had been selective, precise, almost surgical. The casks of palm oil were empty, drained not by pouring but by absorption, the wood dry and cracked as though the oil had been sucked out by something with a thirst that conventional drinking could not satisfy. The coconut water was gone, the clay pots overturned and licked clean, the interior surfaces glazed with a residue that smelled not of coconut but of something sharper, something chemical, something alive. And the dried fish, the beans, the ground nuts, all were untouched, as though the intruder had no interest in protein or carbohydrate, only in the specific nutrients that palm oil and coconut water provided, the oils and the liquids that were not food but fuel for a metabolism that operated on principles Amma could not comprehend. She stood in the pantry doorway, the green haze swirling around her ankles, and she felt the first true crack in her skepticism, the first hairline fracture in the wall of rationality she had built around herself since nursing school. This was not the work of insects. Insects did not drain casks. They did not overturn pots and lick them clean. They did not select specific foods while leaving others untouched. This was the work of something intelligent, something purposeful, something that understood the contents of the pantry and the needs of its own body, and the vulnerabilities of the house that Amma had sealed in desperation, but not in knowledge. She thought of Nana Afia's words. The adze feeds on these things, on the oil and the water and the vitality of the young. And she understood with a clarity that felt like falling that the adze was not merely watching anymore. It was feeding. It had been feeding for days, taking small sips of Maya's vitality through the marks on her skin, supplementing its diet with the palm oil and coconut water that her grandmother had kept as offerings. And now its appetite was growing, its hunger becoming more aggressive, its need outpacing the modest supplies that Amma's grandmother had maintained. The fever was worse by midday. Maya's temperature spiked to 40 degrees Celsius, a level that Amma knew could cause brain damage, convulsions, death. She bathed the child in cool water, administered the last of her antipyretics, held her while she shook with chills that seemed to come from inside the body rather than from any external source. The child was delirious now, speaking in fragments of sentences that did not belong to her, using words in languages that Amma did not recognize, describing visions that could not be the product of a 6-year-old imagination. The man with no skin is drinking from my neck. He says I taste like the river. He says I taste like the beginning. Amma held her tighter, whispered urban comforts, sang the lullabies that had soothed Maya since infancy, and she felt the child's body grow stiff in her arms, the muscles rigid, the back arching in a posture that Amma recognized from her medical training as opisthotonous, a sign of severe neurological dysfunction, of tetanus or meningitis or poisoning, conditions that required immediate hospitalization and intensive care. But there was no hospital here. There was only the house, the village, the green haze of fireflies, and the ancient terror that was older than medicine and deeper than science. She made a decision born of desperation and the memory of her grandmother's journals, which she had found in a wooden chest beneath the sleeping platform, wrapped in cloth that smelled of camphor and decay. The journals were written in a mixture of Twi and English, in her grandmother's cramped and angular hand, and they recorded decades of observations about the house, the village, the forest, and the entities that inhabited the spaces between them. The adze her grandmother had written was not a single creature but a category of creature, a type of being that existed in multiple forms and that could shift between them according to need and opportunity. In its natural state, it was a hunchbacked, jet-black thing with skin like charred wood and talons that could slice through flesh as easily as paper. But in its hunting state, it was a firefly, a spark, a pinpoint of light that could enter through the smallest gap, pass through the thickest wall, infiltrate the most secure fortress. The firefly form was not a disguise but a transmutation, a compression of the creature's true mass into a volume small enough to fit through cracks and keyholes. And the transformation required energy, enormous amounts of energy, which the creature obtained by feeding on the vitality of its victims, the palm oil and coconut water that sustained its metabolism, and the electromagnetic fields that all living things generated. The journals contained instructions, protocols, methods for dealing with the ads that had been passed down through generations of keepers, guardians of the house and the village, who had maintained the balance between the human world and the world of the spirits. The salt at the windows was a barrier, not because salt had magical properties, but because the ads' firefly form could not cross crystalline structures, could not navigate the lattice of sodium chloride that disrupted its electromagnetic field. The coconut water was an offering, a substitute for the vitality of humans, a way of feeding the creature without sacrificing lives. And the windows were sealed at night because the ads was photophilic, drawn to light and warmth, and the bioelectric signatures that humans emitted in their sleep, and darkness was the only sure defense against its hunting instincts. But Amma had violated all of these protocols. She had opened the windows, she had neglected the salt, she had allowed the offerings to run out, and now the ads was inside, not as a firefly at the threshold but as a presence in the house, a hunger that was growing stronger and more specific with every feeding. The journal contained a passage that made Amma's blood run cold, a warning written in red ink in the margin of a page that had been folded and refolded until the creases were white with wear. When the ads has tasted the child, it will not be content with offerings. It will want the source. It will want the sweetness that comes from living blood, from the vitality that is renewed each day by breathing and eating and growing. The offerings are substitute. The child is the meal. And when the ads decides to take the meal, there is only one defense: the iron trap, the salt circle, the forced reversion. But this is dangerous, more dangerous than letting the child go, because the ads in its true form is terrible, and the iron trap must be strong, and the reversion must be complete, or the ads will escape, and its hunger will be magnified 100-fold by the anger of being denied. Amma read this passage 3 times, her hands shaking, and she looked at Maya, who had fallen into a fitful sleep, her body twitching, her lips moving in silent conversation with something that Amma could not see. She looked at the iron laundry basin in the corner of the kitchen, the heavy cast-iron vessel that her grandmother had used for everything from washing clothes to preparing ritual baths, and she understood that the basin was not merely a tool but a weapon, a trap, a prison that could hold the ads if the conditions were right, if the bait was sufficient, if the reversion could be forced before the creature realized what was happening. But the ritual required palm oil, and the palm oil was gone, drained by the creature that had raided the pantry in the night. And it required salt, and the salt was running low, scattered at the thresholds in quantities that were insufficient for the circle that the journal described. And it required strength, physical and mental, to hold the basin closed while the creature inside transformed from firefly to monster, while it screamed and thrashed and tried to break free with a strength that was not natural, not biological, not anything that human muscles could contain. She had to go to the village. She had to find palm oil and salt and perhaps help, though she knew that the villagers would not enter the house, that they understood the danger in a way that she was only beginning to comprehend, that they would offer advice and prayers and sympathetic clucking, but would not risk their own lives for a child that had been touched by the ads. She wrapped Maya in a blanket, placed her on the sleeping platform with a bowl of fresh coconut water that she had prepared from the last of the coconuts in the garden, and she kissed her daughter's forehead, feeling the heat that radiated from the child's skin like a furnace, and she whispered, "I'll be back. I'll be back with everything we need." She did not know if the child heard her. She did not know if the words were true. She only knew that she had to try, that the alternative was to sit in the green haze and watch her daughter fade, bruise by bruise, breath by breath, until there was nothing left but a shell that the adze would discard when the sweetness was gone. She walked to the village in the afternoon heat, the sun hammering down on her head, the red dust of the road coating her sandals and her ankles and the hem of her dress. The village was smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she had grown accustomed to the scale of the city, and the houses seemed to lean inward as she passed, as though they were trying to tell her something, to warn her of something, to draw her into their shadows and keep her from returning to the house that had become a feeding ground. She found the market, a cluster of stalls beneath a mango tree where women sold vegetables and fish and palm oil in plastic bottles and salt in paper cones, and she bought what she needed, paying with the cash she had brought from the city, not bargaining because bargaining required time and she had none, not chatting because chatting required energy and she had spent it all on fear. The women watched her with knowing eyes with the same expression that Nana Afia had worn, and one of them, a young mother with a baby strapped to her back, touched Amma's hand as she handed over the bottles of oil and said, "You must not fight it with anger. The adze feeds on anger as it feeds on fear. You must be cold. You must be iron. You must be the trap, not the prey." Amma nodded, not trusting her voice, and she walked back to the house with her purchases clutched against her chest, the oil sloshing in the bottles, the salt crinkling in the paper, and she felt the weight of the afternoon pressing down on her, the sense that time was running out, that the sun was sinking toward the tree line, and that when darkness fell, the adze would take what it had been waiting for, would finish what it had started, would consume the child and move on to the mother, to the house, to the village, in an endless chain of feeding that would not stop until the balance was restored or until there was nothing left to feed upon. She found Maya still sleeping, still twitching, still breathing in those shallow gasps that seemed to grow weaker with every hour. The fireflies had thickened in her absence, filling the room with a green luminescence that was almost bright enough to read by, and they swirled around the sleeping platform in patterns that suggested excitement, anticipation, the behavior of a predator that had sensed weakness and was preparing to strike. Amma pushed through them, feeling their tiny bodies brush against her face and arms like dust motes in a sunbeam, feeling the cold that emanated from them despite their apparent warmth, and she set to work. She poured the palm oil into the iron basin, filling it to a depth of 3 inches, the liquid golden and viscous in the green light, smelling of the tree and the sun and the earth. She sprinkled salt in a circle around the basin, not the thin scattering she had used at the thresholds, but a thick, continuous line, a barrier that the journal said would contain the adze in its true form, would prevent it from escaping once the reversion was forced. She placed the basin in the center of the main room, where the fireflies were thickest, where the green light was brightest, where the presence of the adze was most concentrated, and she waited. The fireflies swirled faster, their pulsing increasing in frequency until it was no longer a rhythm but a vibration, a hum that traveled through the floor and up through Amma's body, settling in her teeth and her bones and the hollow space behind her eyes. The air grew colder, despite the tropical heat, and the green light intensified until it was painful to look at, a radiance that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the fireflies and from the walls and from the oil in the basin that was beginning to glow with its own internal luminescence, reacting to the presence of the adze in a way that suggested the oil was not merely fuel but a medium, a conductor, a catalyst that enabled the transformation. Amma stood outside the salt circle, her hands clasped behind her back, her nails digging into her palms, her breath coming in shallow gasps that matched the rhythm of the fireflies pulsing, and she watched. The transformation began at the center of the swarm, a single firefly that was larger than the others, that pulsed not with green light but with a white radiance that was painful to look at, that seemed to contain within its tiny body an energy that was disproportionate to its size. This was the adze in its hunting form, the alpha insect, the core of the swarm around which the others orbited like electrons around a nucleus. It hovered over the basin, descending slowly, and Amma saw that it was not merely hovering but examining, assessing, testing the trap with a caution that suggested intelligence, experience, memory of other traps that had been set and other traps that had failed. It knew, she realized with a sinking heart. It knew what the basin was, what the oil was, what the salt circle meant. And it was considering whether to enter anyway, whether the bait was worth the risk, whether its hunger was strong enough to overcome its caution. It entered. The firefly descended into the palm oil, touching the surface with a movement that was almost delicate, almost reverent, and the oil reacted immediately, not with ripples but with a surge, a geyser of golden liquid that rose around the insect and engulfed it, pulling it under with a force that suggested not gravity but intention, not physics but will. The firefly disappeared beneath the surface, and the oil went still, and for a moment Amma thought that she had succeeded, that the trap had worked, that the adze was contained. But then the surface of the oil began to glow, not with the white light of the firefly but with a green luminescence that was darker, deeper, more organic, and the glow spread outward from the center of the basin in concentric rings that matched the rhythm of the firefly's pulsing. And Amma understood that the creature was not trapped but transforming, not captured but preparing, and that the true horror was not the firefly but what came after. The oil began to bubble, not with heat but with movement, something stirring beneath the surface, something large and heavy and alive. The bubbles rose and burst, releasing a smell that was not palm oil but something else, something sulfurous and sweet and rotten, the smell of a body that had been buried in tropical soil for weeks and then unearthed, the smell of decay and life mixed in proportions that defied categorization. And from the center of the bubbling, from the heart of the glow, something began to rise. Amma watched, frozen, as the firefly expanded. It was not growing in the sense of inflating, of increasing in size while maintaining its shape. It was reverting, transforming, unfolding from its compressed state into its true form, the hunchbacked, jet-black thing that her grandmother had described in the journals. But the transformation was not instantaneous. It was slow, deliberate, almost theatrical, as though the creature were showing her what it was, piece by piece, forcing her to witness the horror of its true nature in a way that would burn itself into her memory and feed its hunger for fear as well as for vitality. The green light solidified into a limb, a black arm that rose from the oil with fingers that were too long and too jointed, each one ending in a talon that scraped against the iron of the basin with a sound like nails on slate. Another limb followed, and then a torso, hunched and twisted, covered in skin that was not skin but something like charred wood, cracked and oozing with a liquid that was not blood but something thicker, something that smelled of coconut and palm and the particular sweetness of a child's fever sweat. The head emerged last, rising from the oil with a motion that was almost regal, almost triumphant, and Amma saw its face for the first time. It was not a human face, though it had features that suggested humanity, eyes that were too large and too far apart, a mouth that was too wide and filled with teeth that were not teeth but needles, a nose that was not a nose but a slit that pulsed with the same green light as the fireflies. The skin was black, not the brown black of human skin but the black of charcoal, of burned wood, of something that had been consumed by fire and then reconstituted from the ash. And the eyes, those terrible eyes, were fixed on Amma with an intelligence that was not human, not animal, but something older and colder and infinitely more patient. The creature rose to its full height, standing in the basin with the oil dripping from its limbs, and it stretched, a movement that was simultaneously grotesque and graceful, the hunchback straightening momentarily before returning to its characteristic posture, the talons extending and then retracting, the mouth opening in a yawn that revealed the full horror of its dentition. It was 4 feet tall in its hunch position, perhaps 6 if it straightened fully, and its body was lean but muscular, the skin stretched tight over a frame that was all angles and joints, like a spider or a mantis or something that had evolved in a world where speed and flexibility were more important than strength or size. It looked at Amma, and she felt its gaze like a physical weight, a pressure against her forehead that made her want to fall to her knees, to bow, to submit. And she understood that this was part of its hunting strategy, this psychic domination, this overwhelming of the prey will before the physical attack began. But the salt circle held. The creature reached toward the edge of the basin, toward the salt line that separated it from Amma, and its talon touched the salt with a sound like sizzling meat, and it drew back with a hiss that was not a sound but a sensation, a burst of pressure in Amma's ears that made her cry out and press her hands against her head. The salt was working. The iron was working. The trap was holding, but the creature was not defeated. It was contained, imprisoned, furious, and its eyes fixed on Amma with a hatred that was palpable, a promise of retribution that transcended the physical boundaries of the basin and the salt circle and reached into her mind with tendrils of cold malice. "You cannot hold me," it said, and the voice came not from its mouth but from everywhere, from the walls and the floor and the green haze of fireflies that still swirled around the ceiling, from the oil in the basin and the salt on the floor and the fevered dreams of the child on the sleeping platform. "You do not know what I am. You do not know what I can do. Release me and I will take only the child. Fight me and I will take you both and the village and everything that walks on two legs within a day's journey. I am older than your house, older than your village, older than the trees that surround you. I am the hunger that was here before the first human drew breath, and I will be here when the last human turns to dust. Release me." Amma stood her ground, her hands shaking, her heart hammering, her mind racing through the journal's instructions, searching for the next step, the way to complete the reversion, to force the creature back into its true form, and then to destroy it before it could escape. She knew that the iron basin and the salt circle were only the beginning. The creature was in its true form now, exposed and vulnerable, but it was also at its most dangerous, its most powerful, its most desperate. She needed to act quickly, before it found a way to break the containment, before it realized that the salt was not perfect, that the circle had gaps, that the iron was old and cracked and might not hold against a sustained assault. She reached for the iron lid that she had prepared, the heavy circular cover that her grandmother had used to seal the basin when she was boiling water or steeping herbs, and she lunged forward, slamming the lid down over the creature with a movement that was more instinct than intention, more terror than courage. The creature screamed, a sound that was not a sound but a wave of pressure that shattered the oil lamps and extinguished the candles and plunged the house into darkness, broken only by the green glow of the fireflies and the phosphorescent radiance that seeped through the cracks in the iron lid. Amma threw herself onto the lid, her weight pressing down on the metal, feeling the creature thrash beneath her, its strength terrifying, its body hammering against the iron with blows that dented the metal and sent vibrations through her bones that made her teeth ache and her vision blur. The lid bulged upward, the iron groaning, the screws that held the handle in place popping free and ricocheting across the room like bullets. Amma pressed down harder, her knees on the lid, her hands gripping the edges, her body a human counterweight against the creature's rage. She could feel it transforming again, not reverting but shifting, trying to compress itself back into the firefly form, to slip through the microscopic gaps in the iron, to escape the trap that she had sprung. But the iron held barely, and the salt circle contained the electromagnetic field that the transformation required, and the creature was trapped, caught between forms, neither firefly nor monster but something in between, something that screamed with a voice that was not one voice but many, a chorus of hunger and hatred and ancient, implacable will. "I will kill you slowly," the voices said, rising from the basin, from the floor, from the walls, from the sleeping platform where Maya lay unconscious and unaware of the battle being fought for her life. "I will drink your vitality drop by drop. I will wear your skin as a garment. I will sing your death song in the spaces between the stars, where your God does not listen and your science does not reach. Release me, and I will be merciful. Hold me, and I will teach you the meaning of pain." Amma did not release. She held on, her muscles burning, her mind fragmenting under the assault of the creature's psychic pressure, and she waited for the transformation to complete, for the reversion to stabilize, for the creature to settle into its true form and accept, however temporarily, the prison that she had made for it. The journal had said that the forced reversion was the most dangerous moment, the point at which the adze was most unstable, most unpredictable, most likely to lash out with a force that could destroy the trap and the trapper alike. But it was also the moment of greatest vulnerability, the window during which the creature could be destroyed, if the trapper had the strength and the will to do what was necessary. The thrashing subsided gradually, the creature's energy expended in its futile attempt to escape, and the bulging lid settled back into place, the iron cooling, the vibrations fading to a tremor and then to silence. Amma remained on top of the basin, her body aching, her mind reeling, and she listened. The fireflies had stopped pulsing. The green haze had dissipated, the individual insects settling to the floor like dust, their light extinguished, their purpose fulfilled. The house was dark and silent, and in the darkness, Amma could hear only the sound of her own breathing and the faint, irregular heartbeat of her daughter on the sleeping platform, still alive, still fighting, still hanging on to the vitality that the adze had tried to take. She had won a battle, but the war was not over. The creature was contained, not destroyed, and containment was temporary, fragile, dependent on the strength of old iron and the purity of salt and the will of a woman who was exhausted beyond measure. She needed to finish what she had started. She needed to destroy the adze, permanently, irrevocably, before it could escape and take its revenge on her, and on everything she loved. But first, she needed to rest. Just for a moment. Just long enough to catch her breath, to clear her head, to remember the rest of the journal's instructions, the steps that came after the trap and the reversion, the method of destruction that would ensure the creature could never return. She lay down beside the basin, her hand on the lid, feeling the faint tremor of the creature's breathing beneath the iron, and she closed her eyes, just for a moment, just until the dizziness passed, just until she had the strength to stand and do what needed to be done. She did not mean to sleep, but sleep took her anyway, a sleep that was not rest but surrender, a collapse of body and mind that left her vulnerable and exposed on the floor of the house that had become a battlefield. And in her sleep, she dreamed not of the creature in the basin but of her grandmother, not as she had been in life but as something else, something that stood at the edge of the forest with green eyes and a smile that was not human and that whispered, "You have done well, my child, but the hardest part is yet to come. The adze is patient, the adze is clever, and the adze knows your weakness better than you know it yourself." Amma woke to find that she had not slept for minutes but for hours, the darkness outside complete, the house silent in a way that was more ominous than peaceful. She was still lying beside the basin, her hand numb from the pressure of gripping the iron lid, her body stiff and cold from the damp that rose through the concrete floor. The first thing she noticed was the smell. It had changed during her sleep, transformed from the sulfurous sweetness of the creature's emergence to something else, something that reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen in the old days, before the illness and the senility and the final stroke that had taken her. It was the smell of palm oil heating in a pan, of coconut rice cooking over charcoal, of the particular combination of spices and herbs that her grandmother had used to make the house feel safe, to create an atmosphere of warmth and nourishment that was meant to keep the dark things at bay. Amma's eyes filled with tears before she understood why, and then she realized. The creature was manipulating her, using her memories against her, projecting sense and sensations that bypassed her rational mind and spoke directly to the part of her that was still a child, still vulnerable, still desperate for her grandmother's protection. She sat up, her head spinning, and she looked at the basin. The iron lid was still in place, but it had shifted, moving a fraction of an inch to one side, and a thin line of green light was visible in the gap between the lid and the basin's rim, pulsing with a rhythm that matched her own heartbeat. The creature was awake. The creature was active. And it was pressing against the containment, testing the seal, looking for the weakness that would allow it to escape. Amma pressed her weight back onto the lid, forcing it down, feeling the creature's resistance as a physical push, a strength that was not muscular but electromagnetic, a force that operated on principles that her nursing training had not prepared her to understand or combat. "You are tired," the voice said, and it was not the chorus of many voices that she had heard before but a single voice, a voice that she recognized with a shock that made her gasp and loosen her grip on the lid. It was her grandmother's voice. Not an imitation, not a parody, but the exact timbre and cadence and warmth of the woman who had raised her, who had sung her lullabies and whipped her for disobedience and held her when the nightmares came. "You are tired, my child, and you have fought so hard. Let me help you. Let me take the burden. Open the lid and let me out, and I will make everything right. I will heal the child. I will restore the house. I will protect you from the things that lurk in the dark, as I always have, as I always will." Amma's hands trembled on the iron. The voice was perfect, indistinguishable from memory, and the part of her that was exhausted beyond reason, that had reached the end of her physical and emotional reserves, wanted desperately to believe. She wanted to lift the lid and see her grandmother's face, wrinkled and wise and smelling of palm oil and nutmeg, wanted to feel those arms around her, wanted to surrender the responsibility that had been thrust upon her by circumstances she had never asked for and did not understand. But another part of her, the part that had been forged in the city, in the hospitals, in the world of science and evidence and verifiable truth, knew that her grandmother was dead, buried 6 months ago in the village cemetery, her body returned to the earth that had produced her. The thing in the basin was not her grandmother. It was a parasite that had accessed her memories through the mark it had placed on her mind, that had mined her grief and her love and her longing for the voice of a dead woman, and was using them as bait in a trap more sophisticated than any iron basin or salt circle. "You are not my grandmother," Amma said, her voice hoarse, her hands pressing down on the lid with renewed determination. "My grandmother is dead, and you are the thing that killed her. You are the hunger that wore her down, that took her vitality drop by drop until there was nothing left but a shell. You are the reason she sealed the windows. You are the reason she kept the salt. You are the reason she died alone in this house, too weak to fight, too tired to call for help. And I will not let you do the same to my daughter." The voice shifted, the warmth evaporating, replaced by a coldness that was older and hungrier and infinitely more patient. "Foolish child," it said, and now it was not her grandmother's voice but something else, something that spoke from the walls and the floor and the air itself, from the green light that pulsed beneath the iron lid and the fireflies that had begun to gather again in the corners of the room, drawn by the creature's renewed activity. "You think you understand what I am. You think your science and your salt can contain me, but I am not a disease to be cured or a beast to be caged. I am the hunger that exists in all things, the need that drives the seed to grow, the larva to feed, the predator to hunt. I am the opposite of life, which is not death but stillness, and I am the opposite of death, which is not life but ending. I am the gap between the breaths, the space between the heartbeats, the moment of emptiness that demands to be filled. And your daughter is so very empty now, so very hollow, so very ready to be filled. Let me out and I will fill her. I will make her complete. I will give her a purpose that your human love never could." Amma felt the words like physical blows, each one striking at a different vulnerability, a different doubt, a different fear. She thought of Maya, feverish and pale on the sleeping platform, her body wasted by days of parasitic feeding, her mind drifting in dreams that were not her own. She thought of her own failures as a mother, the divorce, the long hours at work, the moments of impatience and distraction and absence that had accumulated into a guilt so heavy that she could barely carry it. And she thought of the creature's offer, not as a lie but as a truth that was simply framed from the wrong perspective. The ads did not see itself as evil. It saw itself as necessary, as natural, as a force that maintained the balance of the ecosystem by consuming the weak and the empty and the ready. In its own way, it was offering Maya a kind of immortality, a purpose, a place in the natural order that human medicine and human love could not provide. But Amma was not ready to surrender. She pressed down on the lid, her muscles straining, her jaw clenched, and she reached for the journal with her free hand, flipping through the pages with desperate fingers, searching for the next step, the method of destruction that would end the creature's influence forever. The journal fell open to a page that she had not read before, a page that was stained with something brown and old, something that might have been blood or palm oil or the residue of a ritual performed decades ago. The writing was different here, not her grandmother's careful hand but a scrawl that suggested haste and terror, and the words were not in Twi or English, but in a script that Amma did not recognize, characters that seemed to shift and change as she looked at them, resolving into meanings that bypassed her eyes and entered her mind directly. "The ads cannot be killed," the message said, burning itself into her consciousness with a clarity that transcended language. "The ads can only be transformed. Its true form is fire, and fire is its destiny. But the fire must be complete, total, consuming, or the ads will reconstitute itself from the ash and return hungrier than before. The iron trap must be sealed, the salt must be added to the flame, and the sacrifice must be made willingly, not by force but by choice, or the transformation will be incomplete and the ads will survive." Amma read these words with a sinking heart because she understood what they meant. The sacrifice, the willing choice. The journal was telling her that she could not destroy the ads by violence or cunning alone. She had to offer it something, had to give it a path to transformation that was not forced but chosen, had to create a situation where the creature would enter the fire of its own volition, or at least without resistance, so that the transformation would be complete and irreversible. But what could she offer that the ads would accept? What bait could lure a creature that fed on vitality and palm oil and the electromagnetic essence of living things into a fire that would consume it? The answer came to her, not from the journal but from the creature itself, from the voice that was still whispering in her mind, still probing her weaknesses, still offering her grandmother's comfort and Maya's salvation in exchange for the one thing it truly wanted: freedom. The ads wanted to be released from the iron basin. It wanted to return to its hunting form, to its swarm of fireflies, to its methodical consumption of the village and the forest and everything that lived within its reach. And it would accept any bargain, any deception, any temporary compromise that offered the possibility of escape. Amma could use that desire against it. She could create a trap within a trap, a bargain that the creature would think it was making freely, but that would actually lead to its destruction. But the journal warned against deception. The fire must be complete, the choice must be willing. If she tricked the creature, if she forced it into the flame against its will, the transformation would be incomplete and the ads would survive, reduced but not destroyed, angry and vengeful and more dangerous than before. She had to find a way to make the creature choose the fire, to make it see the flame not as destruction but as transformation, as evolution, as the next stage of its existence. And to do that, she had to understand what the ads truly wanted, not just what it said it wanted, not just the freedom and the feeding and the expansion of its territory, but the deeper need that drove all its behavior, the fundamental hunger that defined its existence. She thought of the creature's words, repeated in her mind like a mantra. "I am the gap between the breaths, the space between the heartbeats, the moment of emptiness that demands to be filled." The ads was not merely hungry. It was empty. It was a void that consumed not because it enjoyed consumption, but because consumption was the only way to temporarily fill the void, to create a moment of fullness in an existence that was otherwise endless hunger. It was not evil. It was suffering. And the fire, the complete consuming fire, was not punishment but release, not destruction but transformation into something that was no longer empty, no longer hungry, no longer driven by the desperate need to fill a gap that could never be filled by feeding alone. Amma understood then what she had to do. She had to offer the creature not just freedom but fulfillment, not just escape from the iron basin but escape from the hunger itself. She had to convince the Azde that the fire was not death but the answer to its prayers, the end of the emptiness, the beginning of a new kind of existence that did not require constant consumption. And she had to do it honestly, without deception, because deception would taint the transformation and leave the creature incomplete, vengeful, immortal in its suffering. She leaned close to the basin, her lips inches from the gap where the green light pulsed, and she spoke in a whisper that was softer than the creature's voice, more intimate, more honest. "I know what you are," she said. "I know that you are empty. I know that you eat because you are starving, not because you are cruel. And I know that there is a way to end the hunger. The fire, the transformation, not death but change, not ending but beginning. I can give you that. I can build the fire. I can add the salt. I can create the conditions for your transformation. But you must choose it. You must enter willingly. You must accept that the hunger can end, that the emptiness can be filled, not by consuming others but by becoming something else." The creature was silent for a long moment, and Amma felt its presence in her mind, probing, testing, searching for the deception that it expected to find. But there was no deception. Amma spoke the truth as she understood it, and the truth had a quality that the creature could not ignore, a resonance that spoke to its own deepest nature, its own fundamental emptiness, its own desperate desire for an end to the hunger that had driven it for millennia. "You would give me this?" the creature asked, and for the first time its voice was not threatening or seductive but simply curious, simply open, simply asking. "You would build the fire and let me choose. You would not force me. You would not trick me." "I would give you the choice," Amma said, "because forcing you would doom us both. And tricking you would leave you incomplete, still hungry, still empty, still dangerous. The only way this ends is if you choose to end it. And I believe, beneath everything else, beneath the hunger and the hunting and the terror you have caused, that you are tired, that you have been empty for too long, that you are ready to be something else." Another silence, longer this time, and Amma felt the creature's mind working, weighing, considering possibilities that it had never considered before, alternatives to the endless cycle of feeding and hunger and feeding again. She felt its fear, its suspicion, its ingrained belief that all human offers were traps, all bargains were deceptions, all paths led back to the same eternal emptiness. But she also felt something else, something that was new and fragile and infinitely precious. Hope. The creature was considering hope. It was imagining an existence that was not defined by hunger, a state of being that was not dependent on consumption, a transformation that might finally, after all the centuries of feeding, fill the gap that was its fundamental nature. "Build the fire," the creature said finally, its voice quiet, almost humble, stripped of the grandeur and the threats and the seductive impersonations. "Build the fire and I will consider. I make no promises. I offer no guarantees, but I will consider. And that, human mother, is more than I have offered any of your kind in 10,000 years of hunger." Amma rose, her body aching, her mind exhausted but strangely clear, and she set to work. She gathered the materials that the journal specified: coconut husks, dried and brittle, that would burn hot and fast; salt, the remainder of her supply and more that she found in her grandmother's stores, enough to create a circle around the pyre; palm oil, the last bottle that she had not poured into the basin, to accelerate the flame; and the iron basin itself, the trap that would become the crucible, the prison that would become the doorway. She built the pyre in the center of the main room, not outside in the open air, but inside the house, because the journal specified that the transformation must occur in the space where the Azde had been most active, where its presence was strongest, where the electromagnetic residue of its feeding would provide the catalyst for its change. The pyre was small but dense, a mound of coconut husks and dried herbs, and the splinters of mahogany from an old chair that she broke apart for fuel. She poured the palm oil over it, soaking the husks until they glistened in the green light that still pulsed from beneath the basin's lid. She sprinkled salt in a circle around the pyre, not the thin line of the earlier containment, but a thick, generous ring that would purify the flame and ensure that no fragment of the creature could escape the transformation. And she prepared the basin, lifting it with a strength that came from adrenaline and desperation rather than muscle, carrying it to the edge of the pyre, positioning it so that when the lid was removed, the creature would be between the fire and the salt, with no path of escape except through the flame. Maya was still sleeping, still breathing, still alive, and Amma paused beside her daughter's sleeping platform to brush the hair from her forehead, to feel the fever that was beginning to break, the skin that was cooling from its terrible heat, the vitality that was slowly returning now that the adze was contained and no longer feeding. The child would recover, Amma knew, if the transformation was complete, if the creature was truly transformed and not merely trapped, if the balance could be restored. But there was no guarantee. There was never any guarantee. There was only the choice, the fire, and the hope that emptiness could be filled by something other than consumption. She returned to the pyre, to the basin, to the creature that waited beneath the iron lid with a patience that was older than patience, a hunger that was older than hunger, and a hope that was so new and so fragile that it could be crushed by a single wrong word, a single moment of doubt, a single hesitation in the face of the fire. Amma stood before the basin, her hands on the lid, and she spoke one last time, not to command or to beg, but simply to witness, to acknowledge, to offer the creature the dignity of choice that all living things deserved, even things that were not alive in any conventional sense. "The fire is ready," she said. "The salt is laid, the transformation awaits. I am going to lift the lid. You can emerge as you are in your true form, and you can walk into the fire of your own will, or you can remain in the basin and I will seal it again, and we will continue this war that neither of us can win. The choice is yours. The hunger can end or it can continue, but it cannot end by force. It can only end by choice." She lifted the lid. The lid came off with a sound like the breaking of a seal, the pop of a vacuum releasing, and the green light that had been contained beneath the iron exploded upward in a column of luminescence that illuminated the room with a radiance brighter than daylight, brighter than the oil lamps that had burned in the corners, brighter than the pyre that waited with its soaked husks and its ring of salt. Amma fell back, her hands raised to shield her eyes, and she saw the creature rise from the basin not as a monster climbing out of a prison, but as something being born, something emerging from a chrysalis, something that had compressed itself into a space too small and was now expanding into its true dimensions with a relief that was almost sexual, almost ecstatic, almost holy. It stood at the edge of the pyre, the palm oil dripping from its black skin, the salt sizzling where it touched the creature's feet, and it stretched, a movement that was simultaneously grotesque and beautiful, the hunched back straightening to its full height, the talons extending and then retracting, the mouth opening in a yawn that revealed the needle teeth and the throat that pulsed with green fire. It was 4 feet tall, then 5, then 6, growing as it fed on the electromagnetic energy of the room, on the bioelectric fields of Amma and Maya, on the residual vitality that lingered in the wood and the thatch and the palm oil that had been its sustenance for days. And it turned to Amma with eyes that were no longer black pits but green stars, blazing with an intensity that made her want to kneel to worship, to offer herself as sacrifice to the glory of its presence. "You have given me freedom," it said, and the voice was not the harsh chorus of before but a single voice, melodious, resonant, the voice of a being that had transcended hunger and was approaching something like satisfaction, like fullness, like the end of emptiness. "You have given me choice. And I choose. It paused, its head tilting, its eyes narrowing, and Amma saw the moment of indecision, the flicker of doubt, the ancient instinct reasserting itself. The hunger was not gone. It was merely suppressed, temporarily satiated by the hope of transformation, but it lurked beneath the surface like a shark beneath still water, ready to rise when the promise of food appeared more attractive than the promise of change. "I choose the child," the creature said, and its voice shifted, became her grandmother's voice again, warm and loving and utterly persuasive. "Let me take the child, Amma. Let me fill her emptiness with my fullness. She is so weak, so hollow, so ready to be completed. I can cure her fever. I can restore her vitality. I can make her strong and whole and beautiful in ways that your medicine never could. All you have to do is step aside. All you have to do is let me pass. Open the door, Amma. Open your heart. Let me in, and I will give you back your daughter, better than she was, more than she was, complete in a way that no human child has ever been complete." Amma felt the pull of the voice, the magnetic attraction of the offer, the desperate desire to believe that her grandmother's spirit could save Maya, could undo the damage that the creature itself had caused, could make everything right again. She took a step toward the sleeping platform, toward her daughter, toward the promise of healing and wholeness and happiness that the creature dangled before her like a jewel before a beggar. And then she stopped, because she saw the truth behind the voice, the calculation behind the offer, the hunger that still burned in the green eyes like a pilot light waiting for the gas to flow. "You cannot cure her," Amma said, her voice steady despite the trembling of her body. "You are the disease. You are the cause of her fever, her weakness, her hollowness. You fed on her for days, taking her vitality drop by drop, and now you offer to give it back as though it were a gift rather than a return of stolen property. You are not a healer. You are a parasite, and parasites do not cure. They consume, they use, they destroy, and when they have destroyed one host, they move to the next." The creature's face contorted, the grandmother's mask slipping, revealing the black skin beneath, the needle teeth, the bottomless hunger that was its true nature. "Then you choose death," it said, and the voice was not melodious now but guttural, a scream that emerged not from a throat but from the space between atoms, from the vacuum that the creature inhabited, from the emptiness that was its fundamental essence. "You choose death for yourself, for the child, for the village, for every living thing that walks or crawls or flies within 100 miles. I will consume them all. I will drink their vitality until they are dust. I will wear their skins and sing their songs and dance in their ashes, and you will watch, Amma Osai, you will watch every moment, trapped in your own mind, conscious of every atrocity, unable to look away or close your eyes or die. That is the fate you choose when you deny me. That is the hunger you choose when you refuse to feed it." The creature lunged, not toward Maya but toward Amma, its talons extended, its mouth open, its body moving with a speed that was not natural, not biological, but something that operated on principles of physics that Amma did not understand. It crossed the space between them in a fraction of a second, its black form blotting out the green light, its shadow falling across her like a shroud, and she felt its presence enter her not through the skin, but through the mind, through the mark that it had placed on her during the days of feeding, through the connection that had been established when she first opened the windows and invited the night inside. The possession was not cinematic, not a dramatic seizure or a speaking in tongues or a head-spinning display of supernatural power. It was a slow decay of psyche, a gradual erosion of self, a gentle but inexorable replacement of Amma's thoughts and feelings and memories with the creature's own hunger and emptiness and desperate need. She felt it first as a craving, an intense and irrational desire for the scent of coconut oil, for the taste of palm wine, for the warmth of the sleeping platform and the weight of the humid night. She felt it as a sudden hatred for the village elders, for Nana Afia and her warnings, for the women in the market who had touched her hand and spoken of iron and coldness. She felt it as an urge to seal the house, not from the outside but from the inside, to close the shutters and bar the door and trap herself and Maya in a cocoon of darkness where no one could reach them, where no one could save them, where the feeding could continue uninterrupted until there was nothing left but the creature and its endless, aching hunger. She moved toward the windows, her hands reaching for the shutters, her body operating on autopilot while her mind screamed in silent protest. She could feel the creature inside her, not as a separate entity but as a part of herself, a voice that sounded like her own voice, a desire that felt like her own desire, a choice that seemed like her own choice. It was not controlling her body from the outside. It was becoming her, replacing her, consuming her identity the way it had consumed Maya's vitality, drop by drop, thought by thought, memory by memory. She was being erased, overwritten, turned into a vessel for the hunger that had no name and no end. But Amma was not entirely gone. Some part of her remained, some kernel of self that the creature had not yet reached, some memory that was too precious or too painful to be consumed. It was the memory of Maya's birth, the moment when the child had emerged from her body slippery and screaming and absolutely, irrevocably alive. It was the memory of holding her daughter for the first time, of feeling the weight of the tiny body in her arms, of understanding that she would do anything, sacrifice anything, destroy anything to protect this being that had come from her flesh and her blood and her love. And it was this memory, this kernel, this irreducible core of maternal devotion, that the creature could not consume, could not overwrite, could not replace with its own emptiness. She fought, not with her body, which was still moving toward the windows, still closing the shutters, still sealing the house from the inside, but with her mind, with her will, with the part of herself that was still Amma Osai and not the ads. She reached for the memory of Maya's birth, held it like a torch in the darkness of her possessed consciousness, and she used it to illuminate the creature's presence, to see where it was, how it was operating, what its weaknesses were. And she found them. The creature was not a master of possession. It was an amateur, a novice, a being that had evolved to feed on vitality rather than identity, and its attempt to consume her mind was clumsy, inefficient, full of gaps and errors that a more experienced predator would not have made. She found the gap between her thoughts and the creature's thoughts, the space where her self ended and its hunger began, and she pushed. Not outward, not trying to expel the creature, but inward, compressing her own identity into a smaller and smaller space, making herself dense, making herself hard, making herself into something that the creature could not digest, could not absorb, could not consume. She became iron. She became salt. She became the trap that her grandmother had described, the containment that held the ads not by force but by density, by the sheer weight of a self that refused to be dissolved. The creature felt this and recoiled, its hunger turning to confusion, its confidence turning to fear. It had never encountered a human who could resist possession, who could maintain identity in the face of its overwhelming emptiness, who could become iron instead of food. It tried to retreat, to withdraw from Amma's mind, to escape back into the room and the pyre and the freedom that awaited outside her body. But Amma held it. She held it with the same determination that she had used to hold the iron lid, with the same strength that had allowed her to survive childbirth and divorce and the long, lonely years of single motherhood. She held it, and she walked, her body moving under her own control now, back toward the pyre, back toward the fire, back toward the transformation that the creature had promised and then betrayed. "You chose," she said, her voice strained, her body shaking with the effort of containing the creature within herself while moving toward the flame. "You chose death. You chose hunger. You chose to consume rather than transform. And now I choose for you. I choose the fire. I choose the end of emptiness. I choose the transformation that you were too afraid to accept." She reached the pyre, the creature thrashing inside her mind, its talons scraping against the walls of her consciousness, its screams filling her skull with pressure that made her nose bleed and her ears ring. She bent, her hands finding the matches that she had placed beside the pyre, The wooden sticks with their red tips that represented the oldest technology, the most primitive fire, the human discovery that had separated the species from the darkness and given it the power to choose warmth over cold, light over shadow, life over the endless hunger of the empty night. She struck the match. The flame was small, orange, almost fragile in the green luminescence that filled the room. But it was real. It was human. It was the product of her choice, her will, her refusal to surrender, and she touched it to the pyre. The coconut husks caught immediately, the palm oil igniting with a whoosh that sent flames racing across the pyre, up the walls, toward the ceiling. The salt sizzled, releasing a white smoke that smelled of the ocean and the earth and the purity of crystalline structures that could not be corrupted by hunger or need. And the creature trapped inside Amma's mind felt the fire not as heat but as truth, not as destruction but as revelation. It saw, in the moment before the transformation, what Amma had seen, that the fire was not death but the end of emptiness, that the transformation was not loss but fulfillment, that the choice to burn was the choice to finally, after 10,000 years of hunger, be complete. It did not scream. It sang. A single note, clear and pure, that rose above the crackle of the flames and the hiss of the salt and the thunder of Amma's heartbeat in her ears. A note of release, of surrender, of gratitude. And then the transformation was complete, the creature's essence dissolving into the fire, becoming part of the smoke and the ash and the light that filled the room with a radiance that was not green but golden, not cold but warm, not hungry but full. Amma fell to her knees beside the pyre, the flames licking at her arms, her hair singed, her clothes smoldering, and she wept. Not from pain, though the burns were real and would require treatment. Not from fear, though the danger was not over and the house was burning around her. She wept from relief, from release, from the knowledge that the hunger was gone, the emptiness was filled, and the creature that had haunted her grandmother's house and her grandmother's life and her own childhood nightmares was finally, truly, irrevocably at peace. She crawled to the sleeping platform, the smoke thick around her, the heat intense, and she gathered Maya in her arms, the child light as a bird, her breathing steady now, her skin cool, her eyes fluttering open with a confusion that was infinitely precious because it was normal, it was human. It was the confusion of a child waking from a fever rather than the blank stare of a vessel being prepared for consumption. "Mama," Maya whispered, and Amma held her tighter, and she ran, carrying her daughter through the burning house, past the pyre where the ashes of the adze glowed white-hot, through the door that she kicked open with a strength that came from love rather than muscle, out into the night air that was cool and clean and free of the green haze that had tormented them for days. The villagers came running, drawn by the flames, and they found Amma in the dirt road, clutching Maya, both of them coughing smoke, both of them alive, both of them wrapped in blankets that the women brought and water that the men fetched and comfort that the children offered with the simplicity of those who had not yet learned to fear the things that lurked in the dark. They watched the house burn, the traditional building that had stood for generations, that had been Amma's grandmother's home and Amma's inheritance, and now was nothing but a shell of charred laterite and twisted corrugated iron. And they understood without being told what had happened inside, what battle had been fought, what sacrifice had been made, what victory had been won against a hunger that was older than their village and deeper than their forest. Nana Afia approached Amma as dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, and she knelt beside her, and she touched the burns on Amma's arms with fingers that were gentle and knowing and ancient. "You are the keeper now," she said. "The house is gone, but the knowledge remains. You have seen what your grandmother saw, you have fought what your grandmother fought, and you have won what your grandmother could only hold at bay. The adze is transformed, not destroyed, and its essence remains in the ash and the smoke and the memory of the fire. You must take that memory with you. You must carry it to the city, to the world of machines and noise, and you must remember that the hunger exists everywhere, not just in the forest, not just in the dark, but in the hearts of all who consume without giving back, who take without transforming, who feed without ever being filled. Amma nodded, too exhausted to speak, and she held Maya while the village women prepared food and water and bandages for her burns, while the village men sifted through the ashes to find what could be salvaged and what must be buried, while the village children played in the road as though nothing had happened, as though the night had been ordinary, as though the fire had been an accident rather than a ritual, a transformation rather than a destruction. She ate the food and drank the water and accepted the bandages, and she slept in Nana Afia's house, with Maya curled beside her, and she dreamed not of the creature but of her grandmother, not as she had appeared in the creature's impersonation, but as she truly was, smiling, warm, whole, freed from the burden of the keeper's vigil, released at last into the peace that she had earned through decades of silent struggle against the hunger that never slept. In the morning, they prepared to leave. Amma had arranged for a car to take them to Accra, a hired vehicle that would arrive at noon, and she packed what little remained. Maya's clothes, her own documents, the charred remnants of her grandmother's journals that she had rescued from the ashes, and a small clay jar containing the white residue of the salt that had been sprinkled around the pyre. The jar was cool to the touch, and when Amma held it, she felt a peace that was not her own, a fullness that was not human, the lingering presence of the creature that had chosen transformation over hunger and now existed as something else, something distributed through the smoke and the ash and the memory of the fire. Maya was stronger now, her color returning, her energy restored, chattering about the monkeys she had not seen, and the airplane they would take home and the friends she would tell about her adventure in the village. She did not remember the fireflies or the fever or the voice that had spoken from the walls. She remembered only the fire, which she described as pretty and warm and like a big candle. Amma did not correct her. Some memories were better left buried, transformed by time and storytelling into something that could be born, something that did not require the child to carry the weight of ancient hungers and ancient transformations. The car arrived, a battered Toyota with a driver who chewed cola nuts and spoke of the road conditions, and the weather with the cheerful indifference of someone who had not spent the night watching a house burn. Amma strapped Maya into the back seat and climbed in beside her, and the driver started the engine, and they pulled away from the village, from the ashes, from the forest that stretched behind them like a green wall separating the world of the city from the world of the keepers and the guardians, and the things that lived in the spaces between. The final image came as they rounded the first bend in the road, the village disappearing behind them, the forest closing in around them. Amma looked back, through the rear window at the column of smoke that still rose from the ruins of the house, and she saw something that made her breath catch and her heart stutter. It was a spark, a single green spark, hovering above the smoke, pulsing once with a light that was not threatening but simply present, simply aware, simply saying goodbye. And then it divided, becoming 2 sparks, then 4, then 8, then a constellation of green lights that rose into the morning sky and dispersed, drifting toward the forest, toward the village, toward the spaces between the trees where new keepers would emerge, new guardians would be chosen, and the hunger would continue its endless cycle of feeding and being fed, of emptying and being filled, of dying and being reborn in forms that no human eye had ever seen and no human mind had ever imagined. Amma watched until the sparks were gone, until the sky was empty, until there was nothing to see but the road ahead and the forest on either side and the distant shimmer of the city on the horizon. And then she turned to Maya, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder, and she held her daughter, and she whispered a promise that she intended to keep, a promise that was older than the ads and deeper than the hunger and stronger than any fire. I will protect you. I will always protect you. From the things that lurk in the dark and from the things that hide in the light and from the hungers that exist in every heart, including my own. I will be the keeper. I will be the guardian. I will be the iron and the salt and the fire, and I will never, never let the emptiness consume you. The car drove on, through the forest and the villages and the endless green of the Ghanaian countryside, toward the city and the future and the life that awaited them beyond the reach of the fireflies and the ash and the memory of the thing that had been transformed in the flames. And in the spaces between the trees, in the shadows beneath the leaves, in the microscopic gaps between the atoms of the air itself, something watched them go. Something that was not hungry anymore but was not satisfied either. Something that was learning, evolving, waiting for the next keeper to make the next mistake, to open the next window, to invite the night inside. The Azde was transformed, but transformation was not ending. It was only change. And change, like hunger, was eternal. The road stretched ahead, straight and narrow, and the car moved along it, carrying mother and daughter away from the village and toward the world that did not believe in fireflies that listened, in grandmothers who guarded, in creatures that could be transformed by fire but never truly destroyed. And behind them, in the ashes of the house, in the memory of the green light, in the spaces between what was known and what was feared, the oil in the lamp was already being replenished, the salt was being gathered, and the windows were being sealed against the night that would come again, as it always came, as it always would, until the last human heart stopped beating and the last green spark winked out in the darkness that was older than stars and deeper than time. Maya stirred in her sleep, murmuring something that might have been Mama, or might have been more light, or might have been the first words of a song that had no ending, and Amma held her closer, feeling the warmth of her daughter's body against her own, and she watched the road, and she did not look back again. The past was ash, the future was fire, and the present, this moment, this car, this road, this child breathing against her chest, was all that mattered, all that was real, all that could be held and kept and protected against the hungers that waited in the dark. But she knew, with a knowledge that was deeper than hope and older than fear, that the protection was temporary, the keeping was conditional, and the fire that had transformed the Azde was only one fire in a world that was full of darkness waiting to be illuminated. She was the keeper now, the guardian, the iron and the salt, and she would spend the rest of her life, however long or short it might be, watching for the green sparks, listening for the whispers, sealing the windows against the night that never stopped trying to enter. Because the hunger never slept, the emptiness never filled, and the Azde, transformed but not destroyed, was out there in the spaces between, waiting for the next invitation, the next open window, the next human heart that was willing to believe that the dark was just the absence of light, rather than the presence of something that was older, deeper, and infinitely more patient than any fire. The car drove on and the forest closed behind them and the village disappeared into the green, and somewhere in the ashes of a burned house, a single green spark pulsed once, twice, 3 times, and then went dark. Not forever, just for now. Just until the next night fell and the next window opened and the next hunger awakened to feed. The absence of stars. And the stars are just gone, one by one, like someone's walking across the sky and blocking them out, and I can feel it now. I can feel the pressure of the thing above us. And it's not an aircraft, it's not a cloud, it's not anything I've ever seen before, and I think it's watching us. I think it's looking right at us. And oh God, it's so big, it's so fucking big. The recording ended there, not with a scream but with a sudden burst of static that lasted for 11 seconds before the black box ceased transmission. The Cessna Skyhawk had been chartered by a timber consortium out of Portland, carrying 2 executives and a pilot on a routine survey flight over the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in southwestern Washington. It had taken off from Troutdale Airport at 6:47 p.m. on a clear October evening, filed a flight plan that would take it in a standard grid pattern over the forested slopes of Mount St. Helens, and dropped off radar at 7:23 p.m. at an altitude of 8,000 feet. The wreckage was found 3 days later by a Forest Service helicopter, scattered across a mountainside in a debris field that suggested not a crash in the conventional sense, but something closer to a mid-air disintegration. The fuselage was found intact but crushed, as though it had been pressed between two enormous hands and then released. The metal folded and creased in patterns that the NTSB investigators could not explain. The bodies of the passengers were recovered from inside the crushed cabin, their cause of death officially listed as blunt force trauma consistent with impact, but the pilot's body was never found. The black box recording, recovered from a fragment of the tail section lodged in a cedar tree, was classified for 6 months before a copy leaked to a journalist in Seattle, and by then the official explanation had been established. Pilot error, spatial disorientation, a tragic accident in difficult terrain. The recording was dismissed as the ramblings of a man suffering from hypoxia, and the case was closed. Darcy Kowalski heard the recording for the first time in a basement apartment in Tacoma, sitting on a mattress on the floor with his laptop balanced on his knees and a half-empty bottle of bourbon on the windowsill. He was 36 years old, a disgraced electrical engineer who had once held a top-secret clearance and a position at a defense contractor in Maryland, specializing in electromagnetic pulse shielding for military aircraft and communication systems. His fall from grace had been less public than Eamon Brennan's, but no less complete. A paper he had published in an obscure IEEE journal, suggesting that certain anomalous electromagnetic events in the Pacific Northwest were not natural phenomena, but the signatures of an unknown biological entity, had resulted in the revocation of his clearance, the termination of his employment, and a settlement that included a non-disclosure agreement and a warning, delivered in person by two men in suits who did not identify their agency, that further discussion of his theories would result in prosecution under the Espionage Act. Darcy had laughed at them, had told them that his theories were barely credible enough to get him fired, let alone prosecuted for espionage, but the look in their eyes had stopped his laughter cold. They were not threatening him because they thought he was dangerous. They were threatening him because they were afraid, and their fear had been the most terrifying thing Darcy had ever seen, until he heard the black box recording and understood that whatever had made those men afraid was real, and that it was still out there, and that the stars were still blinking out one by one in the forests of Washington state. He played the recording 3 times, his engineering mind parsing the pilot's words for data that could be extracted from the panic. The pilot had not been hypoxic. His speech was clear, his diction precise, his descriptions too detailed to be the product of oxygen deprivation. He had seen something massive, something that blocked out the stars not by emitting light but by absorbing it, something that created a pressure wave that the pilot could feel in his chest, even at 8,000 feet. And the static at the end of the recording was not ordinary radio interference. Darcy ran it through a spectral analysis on his laptop, using software he had developed for his classified work, and he found patterns in the static that suggested not random noise but organized electromagnetic disruption, a pulse that had fried the aircraft's electronics in a fraction of a second, leaving the black box as the only surviving recorder because it was shielded in a Faraday cage designed to withstand lightning strikes. Whatever had taken down, the Cessna had emitted an electromagnetic pulse strong enough to destroy unshielded electronics at a distance of at least 50 feet, and it had done so not as a weapon, but as a byproduct of its presence, the way a human body emits heat or a lightning storm emits radio waves. The pilot had not crashed. He had been swatted from the sky by something that generated EMP as naturally as Darcy generated body heat. The call came 3 days after Darcy downloaded the leaked recording, a phone call from a blocked number that he almost didn't answer because he had stopped answering unknown numbers after the men in suits had visited him. The voice on the other end was female, precise, with the accent of someone who had learned English in a British boarding school and then spent decades erasing the evidence. Mr. Kowalski, my name is Dr. Helen Vance. I represent a private consortium that is very interested in your work on biological electromagnetic signatures. We're prepared to offer you a significant sum to consult on a project in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. I believe you know the area. I know it from satellite imagery and geological surveys, Darcy said, his hand tightening on the phone. I've never been there. That's about to change, Vance said. We have a problem that your expertise might help solve. A dead zone approximately 15 square miles where modern electronics fail. GPS doesn't work. Internal combustion engines stall. Radio signals are absorbed. The Forest Service calls it a geological anomaly. We call it an opportunity. And we think you might call it something else entirely. We think you might call it a Batsquatch. Darcy should have hung up. He should have packed his bags and moved to another city, changed his name, disappeared into the anonymous masses of urban America where men in suits and women with boarding school accents could not find him. But the word Batsquatch had triggered something in him, a memory of the case files he had reviewed during his classified work, the reports that had been dismissed as hoaxes and hysteria, the photographs of vehicles found abandoned in the forest with their engines stripped of spark plugs and batteries, the witness accounts of a creature with blue fur and leathery wings and eyes that glowed red in the darkness. He had compiled those files, had analyzed them, had concluded that they described not a cryptid in the traditional sense, but a biological entity that had evolved to interact with electromagnetic fields, that fed on electrical energy, the way other animals fed on carbohydrates or protein. He had been fired for publishing that conclusion, had been threatened for believing it, and now, 2 years later, someone was offering him a chance to prove that he had been right all along. How much? He asked. Enough to make your NDA irrelevant, Vance said. Enough to buy you a new life if that's what you want, or enough to buy you the truth if that's what you're after. We're sending a car tomorrow morning. Be ready. The car was a black SUV with tinted windows, driven by a man who did not speak and who wore sunglasses despite the overcast sky. They drove south from Tacoma, through the urban sprawl of Olympia, and into the increasingly rural landscape of Lewis County, where the clear-cuts gave way to second-growth forest, and the road began to climb into the foothills of the Cascades. Darcy had brought his equipment in a hard-sided case, portable spectrum analyzers, electromagnetic field detectors, a Faraday-shielded laptop that he had built himself after his confiscated work equipment had been returned with its hard drives wiped. He had also brought a handgun, a Glock 19 that he had purchased legally after the men in suits had visited him, loaded with hollow-point rounds that he suspected would be as effective against a Batsquatch as spitballs against a tank. The weapon was a comfort, not a strategy. If his theories were correct, the creature he was hunting did not operate on a scale where firearms mattered. It was an electromagnetic entity, a biological anomaly that had evolved in the shadow of volcanic activity, feeding on the natural currents generated by the Earth's magnetic field, and more recently, on the artificial currents generated by human technology. The dead zone in Gifford-Pinchot was not a place where electronics failed because of geology. It was a place where electronics failed because something was eating them. They arrived at the consortium's field station at dusk, a compound of prefabricated buildings and satellite dishes nestled in a clearing 10 miles from the nearest paved road. The station was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire, and the gate was guarded by 2 men in tactical gear who checked Darcy's credentials against a tablet that appeared to be running on some kind of independent power source, shielded from the dead zone's effects. Dr. Vance met him at the entrance, a tall woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes the color of glacier ice. She wore a white lab coat over hiking clothes, and she smelled of antiseptic and something else, something that Darcy recognized after a moment as ozone, the sharp metallic scent of ionized air that he had associated in his previous work with high-voltage equipment and lightning strikes. "Welcome to the edge of the map, Mr. Kowalski," she said, leading him into the main building. Or perhaps I should say, welcome to the place where the map becomes irrelevant. The interior of the field station was a contradiction in terms, a high-tech laboratory in the middle of a zone where high technology was supposedly impossible. The equipment was all hardened, Darcy noticed, shielded against electromagnetic interference, running on independent generators that were themselves enclosed in Faraday cages. The scientists moved with the brisk efficiency of people who were working against a deadline they did not fully understand, and the whiteboards were covered in equations that Darcy recognized as his own, published in the paper that had ended his career, now being expanded and modified by minds that had access to resources he had never dreamed of. "You've been following my work," he said, not as a question but as a statement. "We've been following your work since before you published it," Vance said. "Your employers at the defense contractor were, let's say, unenthusiastic about your theories, but not everyone shares their skepticism. We've had teams in this forest for 18 months, mapping the dead zone, tracking the phenomenon, trying to understand what we're dealing with. And we've reached the conclusion that you reached 2 years ago. The Batsquatch is not a myth. It is a biological entity that feeds on electromagnetic energy, and it has evolved to become the apex predator of the electronic age." She showed him the data, hours of it, recorded by teams that had ventured into the dead zone and returned with instruments that had been drained of power, cameras that had captured nothing but static, audio recorders that had picked up sounds that could not be identified. The dead zone was not static. It moved, shifting its boundaries from day to day, expanding and contracting in patterns that suggested not random geological fluctuation but deliberate behavior, as though the creature at its center were testing the limits of its territory, probing for weaknesses, learning. And at the center of the zone, the data suggested, was a point of maximum disruption, a location where the electromagnetic field was not merely disturbed, but inverted, where the normal polarity of the Earth's magnetic field was reversed, creating a kind of vortex that drew energy inward like a whirlpool draws water. "We call it the nest," Vance said, pointing to a topographical map where the vortex was marked with a red X. "It's located in a cave system formed by the 1980 eruption, a series of lava tubes that extend for miles beneath the surface. We believe the creature lives there, deep in the earth, and emerges at night to hunt, to feed." "To feed on what?" Darcy asked. "On us," Vance said simply. "On our technology, on our cars and our phones and our cameras and our satellites, on the electromagnetic signature that human civilization emits like a beacon, announcing our presence to anything that has the senses to perceive it. The Batsquatch doesn't hunt for meat, Mr. Kowalski. It hunts for energy, and we've been feeding it for decades, ever since the first radio tower was erected in this forest, ever since the first car drove down these roads, ever since the first smartphone pinged a cell tower. We've been ringing the dinner bell, and the creature has been answering." Darcy spent his first night at the field station in a state of nervous exhaustion, unable to sleep, poring over the data that Vance had provided and finding in it confirmation of everything he had theorized and more. The creature was not merely a consumer of electromagnetic energy. It was a producer, generating its own fields as a byproduct of its metabolism, fields strong enough to disrupt human technology at distances of up to 5 miles. The dead zone was not a passive absence of signal, but an active field of suppression, a bubble of electromagnetic silence maintained by the creature's presence at its center. And the sightings, the rare and terrifying encounters that had been reported over the decades, were not random. They were hunting expeditions, patrols of the territory's perimeter, conducted by an entity that understood the relationship between electromagnetic emissions and prey availability. The Batsquatch had learned that cars carried batteries, that radios carried power cells, that humans carried devices that hummed with the energy it craved. It had learned to associate the scent of ozone and the crackle of static with the presence of food. In the morning, Vance took him to meet the locals. The consortium had established relationships with the residents of the nearby town, a logging community called Cougar that had seen better days and now survived on a combination of tourism and government subsidies. The locals knew about the dead zone, knew that their cars sometimes stalled on certain roads, that their cell phones sometimes died for no reason, that their radios sometimes filled with static that sounded almost like voices. But they did not fear these phenomena. Instead, they treated the forest with a reverence that bordered on religious devotion. They left offerings at the tree line, Vance explained, bundles of raw meat and scrap metal placed on flat stones that had been worn smooth by decades of use. They call it the old custom, Vance said as they drove through the town, past houses with solar panels and wind chimes and gardens protected by fences that seemed more symbolic than practical. They don't talk about it with outsiders, but we've managed to establish some trust. They believe the forest has a spirit, a guardian that must be appeased. They don't understand the science, but they understand the behavior. They know what the creature wants and they give it what it wants, and in exchange, they are left alone. Darcy met an old woman named Mrs. Peabody who had lived in Cougar for 70 years and who spoke of the forest in the tones of a grandmother discussing a wayward but beloved child. "It doesn't want to hurt us," she said, sitting on her porch with a cup of herbal tea that smelled of cedar and chamomile. "It wants to be left alone. The meat, the metal, those are gifts, not bribes. They're acknowledgments that we're visitors in its home. My grandfather taught me to leave offerings at the stones, and his grandfather taught him, and so on back to the men who first logged these mountains. They learned quickly, the early ones. They learned that the forest gives, but it also takes. That the mountain has a heartbeat, and the heartbeat has a guardian, and the guardian doesn't suffer fools." "Have you seen it?" Darcy asked. "The guardian," Mrs. Peabody smiled, a toothless expression that was somehow more unsettling than a scream. "I've seen the absence of it," she said. "I've seen the stars blink out, one by one, on a clear night when there were no clouds. I've seen my dogs lie down and cover their eyes with their paws, whining like puppies, while something moved through the trees that made no sound but filled the air with a pressure like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. I've seen the tracks in the ash, the great wing prints pressed into the mud, and I've smelled the ozone and the rotting fruit, and I've known, in my bones, that there are things in this world that science cannot explain and that religion cannot save us from. So I leave my offerings and I keep my windows shut after dark, and I teach my grandchildren to do the same. And I hope, Mr. Kowalski, that whatever you're doing in that compound of yours, whatever machines you're building and whatever plans you're making, I hope you understand that the guardian is not a problem to be solved. It is a fact to be accepted. And facts, unlike problems, do not go away when you stop paying attention to them." Darcy returned to the field station that evening with Mrs. Peabody's words echoing in his mind, and he found Vance in the command center, poring over satellite imagery that showed heat signatures in the forest, patterns of movement that suggested something large and warm was traveling through the dead zone on a regular circuit. "We're going in tomorrow," she said without looking up. "A full team, armed and shielded, with the objective of reaching the nest and obtaining a tissue sample. We believe the creature's fur is composed of conductive filaments, a biological adaptation that allows it to channel electromagnetic energy. If we can analyze those filaments, we can replicate them. We can create a new generation of shielding materials, of energy-absorbing technologies, of military applications that would make our current capabilities look like stone axes." "You're going to try to capture it," Darcy said, his voice flat. "We're going to try to understand it," Vance corrected, though her eyes betrayed her. "And understanding in this case requires proximity. We need a sample, Mr. Kowalski. We need data. We need to know what we're dealing with if we're going to defend against it." "Defend against it," Darcy laughed, a harsh sound that startled the technicians working nearby. "You don't defend against a force of nature. You get out of its way. You respect its boundaries. That's what the locals understand, and that's what you don't. You're not going to capture the Batsquatch, Dr. Vance. you're going to annoy it. And when you annoy something that generates EMP as a byproduct of breathing, you don't get a second chance to learn from your mistakes. Vance looked at him then, her glacier eyes hard and cold. That's why we hired you, Mr. Kowalski, to make sure we don't make mistakes. Your job is to shield our team, to manage the electromagnetic environment, to keep our equipment functioning long enough to get the sample and get out. You're our insurance policy. And insurance policies, as I'm sure you know, are only valuable if they're paid up. So I suggest you get some sleep. Tomorrow, we hunt the hunter. Darcy lay in his bunk that night, listening to the generators hum and the wind in the trees, and he thought of the pilot's final words, the calm description of stars blinking out one by one, and he wondered if the man had known in his last moments that he was not experiencing hypoxia but revelation, that he was seeing the world as it truly was, stripped of the electromagnetic noise that human civilization imposed upon it, exposed to the vast and ancient silences that existed before technology and would exist after it. He wondered if the guardian of the forest, the creature that Vance wanted to capture and weaponize, was not a monster but a teacher, a reminder that the universe was not made for human convenience, that there were forces in the world that could not be controlled or understood, only accepted and respected. And he wondered, with a fear that settled in his stomach like a stone, whether his electromagnetic shielding would be enough to protect him from what was coming, or whether he would end up like the pilot, describing the impossible in a voice that was calm because terror had transcended panic and reached a plateau of pure, crystalline awareness. The stars are blinking out, one by one, and something massive is stepping in front of the night sky, and it is looking at me, and it is hungry, and there is nowhere to run. They set out at dawn, a convoy of 3 armored vehicles that had been modified with Darcy's shielding specifications, their engines encased in Faraday cages, their electronics running on independent battery systems isolated from the vehicle chassis. The team consisted of 8 people: Vance, who directed operations from the lead vehicle, 2 security contractors with military backgrounds and expressions that suggested they had seen things they did not discuss, 3 scientists carrying specimen collection equipment, a communications specialist with a Faraday-shielded radio, and Darcy, who sat in the back of the second vehicle with his spectrum analyzer running, watching the electromagnetic environment change as they penetrated deeper into the dead zone. The transition was gradual at first, a gradual degradation of GPS signal, a slight roughness in the engine's performance that the driver compensated for without comment. But by the time they had traveled 5 miles into the forest, the degradation had become catastrophic. The GPS failed completely, the screen going black as though the satellites had ceased to exist. The radio filled with a static that Darcy recognized from the black box recording, that same patterned noise that suggested organized disruption rather than random interference. And the engines, despite their shielding, began to stutter, coughing and surging as though struggling to breathe in an atmosphere that had become somehow thinner, somehow wrong. Darcy monitored his instruments, his heart rate elevated but his hands steady, and he saw what the shielding could not prevent. The electromagnetic field in the dead zone was not merely suppressed, it was inverted, twisted into configurations that his equipment could measure but not explain. The Earth's natural magnetic field, which should have been a steady gradient of approximately 50 microteslas, was fluctuating wildly, spiking to 10 times its normal strength, and then dropping to near zero in patterns that suggested not geological variation but deliberate modulation. Something was generating a field of its own, a field that interacted with the Earth's magnetism the way a tuning fork interacts with a guitar string, creating harmonics and resonances that produced the dead zone as a byproduct. And that something was close, closer than the instruments suggested, because the field strength was increasing not gradually but in sudden bursts, as though the source were moving toward them, testing their defenses, probing for weaknesses. "Stop the vehicles," Darcy said into his shielded microphone, and Vance's voice came back, sharp and impatient. "We're still 3 miles from the nest. We need to keep moving." "If we keep moving, we won't have engines to move with," Darcy said. "The shielding is holding, but only barely. The creature is near, and it's reading our electromagnetic signatures like a menu. We need to shut down, go silent, and wait for it to pass." There was a pause, a consultation that Darcy could not hear, and then Vance's voice returned, colder than before. "We didn't come this far to hide, Mr. Kowalski, but we'll compromise. We'll proceed on foot from here. The vehicles are too conspicuous anyway." They dismounted, pulling on backpacks and checking weapons, and Darcy shouldered his equipment case with a sense of foreboding that he could not shake. The forest around them was old growth, cedar and hemlock and Douglas fir that had stood for centuries before the first white settlers arrived, and the undergrowth was dense with ferns and salal, and the tangled deadfall of trees that had fallen and been left to rot by a forest service that understood, in its better moments, that dead wood was not waste but habitat. The air smelled of moss and decomposition and something else, something that Darcy had noticed immediately when he stepped from the vehicle. A faint, acrid scent, like ozone mixed with rotting fruit, that seemed to emanate from the forest itself rather than from any single source. They walked in single file, the security contractors in the lead with their rifles at the ready, Vance behind them with a tablet that had long since lost its signal and now served as a clipboard for handwritten notes, and Darcy in the rear with his spectrum analyzer and his Faraday-shielded flashlight, which produced a beam of light that seemed dimmer than it should have been, as though the darkness of the forest were not merely an absence of light, but a positive force that consumed illumination. They followed a game trail that wound through the undergrowth, climbing steadily toward the elevation where the nest was located. And as they walked, Darcy became aware of a pressure in his head, a sensation that started as a mild headache and gradually intensified into something that felt like the moment before a nosebleed, a pressure building behind his eyes and in his sinuses that made him want to sneeze or scream or both. He mentioned it to Vance, who dismissed it as altitude adjustment, but the pressure continued to build, and with it came something else, something that he could only describe later as a presence. It was not a sound, not a sight, not any sensory input that he could identify, but a certainty, an absolute knowledge that something was watching them, something that was not human and not animal but something else entirely, something that regarded them with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing bacteria through a microscope. "Do you feel that?" he asked the communications specialist, a young woman named Chen who had been walking beside him in silence. "Feel what?" she asked, but her voice was strained, and Darcy noticed that she was rubbing her temples with the heels of her hands. The pressure, the sense of being watched. Chen stopped walking and looked at him, her eyes wide in the dim light that filtered through the canopy. "I thought it was just me," she whispered. "I thought I was imagining it. But it's getting stronger, isn't it? The closer we get to the nest, the stronger it gets." Darcy nodded, and they walked on, the pressure increasing with every step, until they rounded a bend in the trail and found themselves in a clearing that should not have existed, a natural amphitheater in the forest where the trees had been bent and broken in a pattern that radiated outward from a central point, as though something massive had landed there with the force of a meteor strike. In the center of the clearing was the circle. Darcy counted 12 vehicles, arranged in a perfect ring that faced inward, their noses touching at the center like the petals of a flower or the teeth of a trap. They were from different eras. A Ford Bronco from the 1980s, its paint faded to primer gray. A Chevrolet pickup from the mid-1990s, its body rusted but intact. A Subaru Outback from the early 2000s, its windows shattered. And newer vehicles, a Jeep Wrangler from 2015, a Toyota Tacoma from 2018, all of them bearing the dust and debris of years of exposure, but all of them fundamentally intact, preserved by the dead zone's electromagnetic stasis in a way that prevented the normal processes of decay. The vehicles were not wrecked, not crashed, not abandoned in haste. They were parked, deliberately and carefully, in a configuration that suggested not panic but ceremony, as though they had been placed there as offerings or as warnings. Darcy approached the 1994 pickup, the one that matched the description of Brian Canfield's vehicle, and he felt the pressure in his head intensify to a level that made his vision swim. He reached out to touch the driver's side door, and the moment his fingers made contact with the metal, he was hit by a wave of sensation that was not memory but something more immediate, something that bypassed his conscious mind and implanted itself directly in his limbic system. He was Brian Canfield, 19 years old, driving home from a friend's house at 2 in the morning, taking the forest road because it was shorter and because he had driven it 100 times before without incident. The radio was playing Nirvana and the night was clear and the stars were bright, and then they weren't. One by one, the stars blinked out, blocked by something massive that stepped across the sky, and Brian felt the pressure in his head, the same pressure Darcy was feeling now, and he looked up through the windshield to see the creature land on the hood of his truck, its weight bending the metal, its blue fur crackling with static electricity that made the hairs on Brian's arms stand up. It was 9 feet tall, winged but not flying, its wings folded against its back like a bat's, its eyes glowing red in the darkness, and it reached through the windshield with a hand that was not a hand, but a cluster of conductive filaments that wrapped around Brian's face and sent a current through his skull that erased his memory. His consciousness, his self, leaving him empty and terrified and alive but not living, a shell that would spend the rest of his life in institutions, unable to explain what had happened, unable to forget the smell of ozone and rotting fruit that lingered in his nostrils like a curse. Darcy jerked his hand back from the truck and fell to his knees in the dirt, vomiting into the ferns, his body shaking with the aftershocks of the sensory assault. Vance was beside him in an instant, her hand on his shoulder, her voice sharp with concern that might have been genuine or might have been the impatience of a project manager whose tool had malfunctioned. "What happened? What did you see?" "I didn't see anything," Darcy gasped, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "I felt it. I felt what Brian Canfield felt. The creature didn't just take his battery, it took his mind. It feeds on electromagnetic energy, but it also processes information electromagnetically. It doesn't just consume power, it consumes memory, experience, consciousness. We're not prey to it. We're batteries with data storage." Vance's eyes narrowed, and Darcy saw the calculation behind her concern, the assessment of risk versus reward that was already concluding that his breakdown was an acceptable cost if the data was valuable. "Can you continue?" she asked. "Can you function?" Darcy looked at her, at the circle of vehicles, at the broken trees that radiated outward like the spokes of a wheel, and he understood that they were not in a forest anymore. They were in a pantry. They were in a larder. And the creature that had arranged these vehicles in their perfect circle was not a mindless beast but a collector, a curator, a predator that understood the value of what it hunted and stored its trophies with the same care that a human might apply to organizing a wine cellar. "I can function," he said, rising to his feet, his legs unsteady but his resolve hardening. "But we need to understand what we're walking into. This isn't a nest. It's a library. The creature collects vehicles because they contain the electromagnetic signatures of their owners, the bioelectrical patterns of human consciousness that are stored in the nervous system and echoed in the electronics. It strips the batteries and spark plugs not just for the energy but for the information, the memories, the experiences. It eats our lives, Dr. Vance. It consumes what makes us human, and it leaves the shells behind, arranged in circles to mark its territory, to warn others away, to display its power." Vance stared at him, and for a moment the calculation in her eyes faltered, replaced by something that might have been fear. "Then we need to be careful," she said, her voice quieter than before. "We need to approach the nest with our electronics minimized, our electromagnetic signatures reduced. We need to be ghosts." "Ghosts don't carry rifles," Darcy said, nodding at the security contractors, who had positioned themselves around the perimeter of the clearing with their weapons raised, scanning the tree line for threats that their human senses could not detect. "Ghosts don't carry specimen collection kits and Faraday-shielded tablets. We're not ghosts, Dr. Vance. We're lanterns. We're beacons. And the creature knows we're here. It has known since we crossed the boundary of the dead zone. The only question is whether it's hungry enough to come for us now, or whether it's patient enough to wait until we're deeper in its territory, until we have no way back." They left the circle of vehicles behind, pressing deeper into the forest, and Darcy felt the psychic pressure increase with every step, the sensation of being watched evolving into something more intimate, more invasive. It was no longer a general sense of observation, but a specific attention, a focus that he could feel like a hand pressing against his forehead, probing, testing, tasting his electromagnetic signature the way a snake tastes the air. He remembered the old woman's words, Mrs. Peabody's calm assertion that the Guardian was not a problem to be solved, but a fact to be accepted, and he understood that the creature was not merely aware of them but was studying them, learning them, mapping their weaknesses and their strengths with the same thoroughness that it applied to its territory. It was intelligent, not in a human way but in a way that was older and more comprehensive, a form of cognition that operated on electromagnetic fields rather than neural networks, that processed information through conductive filaments rather than synapses. The nest was not what Darcy had expected. They found it in the late afternoon, after hours of hiking through terrain that grew increasingly alien, the trees twisted into shapes that suggested not natural growth but electromagnetic deformation, their trunks bent and spiraled by fields that had warped their cellular development over decades of exposure. The cave entrance was a black maw in the side of a volcanic ridge, formed by the 1980 eruption that had blasted Mount St. Helens into the world's consciousness and created a landscape that was still recovering, still raw, still haunted by the memory of fire and ash. But the cave was not empty, not a simple lava tube hollowed by ancient forces. It was occupied, inhabited, transformed by the creature that had made it its home. The entrance was framed by a woven structure that Darcy could only describe as a nest in the most literal sense, though it was built not of twigs and grass, but of volcanic ash and charred cedar, woven together with a precision that suggested not instinct but artistry. The ash was compacted into sheets that resembled felt, layered and interlocked to form walls that were porous enough to allow airflow but dense enough to block light. And the cedar was not merely placed but woven, its branches interlaced in patterns that seemed almost geometric, almost mathematical. Darcy reached out to touch the structure and felt a tingling in his fingertips, a subtle current that ran from the nest into his nervous system, and he jerked his hand back, understanding that the nest was not merely a shelter but a conductor, a capacitor, a biological battery that stored electromagnetic energy the way a conventional battery stored chemical energy. Inside, the cave opened into a chamber that was lined with the same woven material, the walls covered in sheets of compacted ash that glowed faintly in the darkness, with a phosphorescence that seemed to pulse in rhythm with Darcy's own heartbeat. And on the floor of the chamber, arranged in concentric circles like the vehicles in the clearing outside, were the remains of the creature's feeding. Batteries, hundreds of them of every size and type, from AA cells to car batteries to industrial power cells that must have been stolen from construction sites or utility vehicles. They were not merely discarded but arranged, sorted by size and by voltage, connected to each other with filaments of blue material that Darcy recognized immediately as the creature's fur, the conductive threads that allowed it to channel energy from one source to another, to create circuits that stored and distributed power with an efficiency that human technology could not match. But it was not the batteries that made Darcy freeze in the entrance to the chamber, his breath caught in his throat, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was the walls. The walls of the chamber were covered in what looked at first like graffiti, like the random scratching of an animal marking its territory. But as Darcy's eyes adjusted to the phosphorescent glow, he saw that the markings were not random. They were pictographs, symbols, a visual language written in electromagnetic burns on the surface of the ash sheets. And they told a story that Darcy could read not with his eyes but with his mind, because the creature had written them not in pigment but in magnetic fields, and his exposure to the dead zone had sensitized him to those fields in a way that allowed him to perceive the information directly. The story was old, older than human civilization, stretching back to the volcanic eruptions that had shaped the Cascades millions of years ago. The creature, the Batsquatch, the guardian, the electromagnetic apex predator, was not a single entity but a species, or perhaps a lineage, that had evolved in the shadow of volcanic activity, feeding on the natural currents generated by geothermal processes, by the movement of magma beneath the Earth's crust, by the piezoelectric effects of tectonic pressure. It had lived in these caves for millennia, emerging only to hunt, to feed on the energy of lightning storms and the bioelectric fields of animals, and it had existed in a state of equilibrium with the landscape, a predator that took what it needed and no more, that maintained the balance of the ecosystem by culling the weak and the careless. But then the humans had come, with their technology and their electromagnetic emissions, and the creature had discovered a new food source, a rich and abundant source that was easier to hunt than lightning and more concentrated than animal nervous systems. It had adapted, had learned to seek out human technology, had developed the behaviors that the locals called the old custom, the pattern of taking and leaving that was not random predation, but a form of agriculture, a cultivation of the electromagnetic landscape that the humans had created. And now, the pictographs suggested, the creature was changing again. The human electromagnetic emissions were increasing, growing stronger and more complex, and the creature was growing with them, developing new abilities, new sensitivities, new ways of interacting with the technology that it fed upon. The dead zone was not a static phenomenon, but an expanding one, growing year by year as the creature's appetite grew, as its population grew, as its understanding of the electromagnetic world deepened. The nest that Darcy stood in was not the only one. There were others, scattered through the Cascades, connected by networks of caves and electromagnetic fields that allowed the creatures to communicate, to share information, to coordinate their hunting. The Batsquatch was not a monster. It was a civilization, or the beginning of one, a form of intelligence that was evolving in parallel with human technology, and that would eventually, inevitably, come into conflict with human civilization in ways that could not be resolved by capture or containment. Darcy staggered back from the entrance, his mind reeling from the information overload, his body shaking with the aftereffects of the electromagnetic exposure. Vance caught him, her hands strong and cold, and she pulled him away from the nest, back into the relative normalcy of the forest, where the pressure in his head was slightly less intense, where the sense of being watched was slightly less intimate. "What did you see?" she demanded. "What was in there?" "Everything," Darcy gasped. "Everything and nothing. It's not a nest, Dr. Vance. It's a brain. It's a distributed intelligence that uses electromagnetic fields as neurons, that stores its memories in magnetic patterns on volcanic ash, that communicates with its kind through pulses of energy that we can't perceive. And it's not alone. There are more of them, dozens, maybe hundreds, throughout the Cascades, and they're learning, they're evolving, and they're hungry." Vance's face went pale, and for a moment the mask of the corporate scientist slipped, revealing the human being beneath, frightened and uncertain and suddenly aware that she had underestimated what she was dealing with. "We need to get back," she said. "We need to report this. We need to leave," Darcy interrupted. "Not just retreat to the vehicles. Leave the forest, leave the state, abandon everything electronic and walk out, because the creature knows us now. It has tasted our electromagnetic signatures, has read our minds through the fields we emit, and it has marked us. I can feel it, Dr. Vance. I can feel the mark, the tether, the connection that it has established between its mind and mine. It's not going to let us go. It's going to follow us, hunt us, consume our electromagnetic energy and our memories and our consciousness, and it's going to add us to its collection, to its library, to its growing understanding of the human world. Vance stared at him, and then she turned to the security contractors, her voice snapping back to its authoritative register. "We're aborting the mission. Return to the vehicles. Move." But even as she gave the order, Darcy felt the pressure in his head spike, and he knew, with a certainty that transcended rational thought, that it was too late. The creature had been patient, had allowed them to approach its nest, to observe its secrets, to learn what it wanted them to learn, and now it was closing the trap. The dead zone was not a passive defense but an active weapon, and they were deep inside it, surrounded by a creature that could manipulate electromagnetic fields with the precision of a surgeon and the power of a god. The scream that erupted from the forest was not a sound but a pulse, a wave of electromagnetic energy that hit Darcy like a physical blow, sending him to his knees, his vision flashing with colors that did not exist, his ears ringing with frequencies that were not audible. He saw the security contractors fall, their weapons dropping from nerveless fingers, their bodies convulsing as the pulse disrupted their nervous systems. He saw the scientists collapse, their specimen kits spilling into the dirt, their faces contorted in expressions of terror that they could not vocalize because their vocal cords were paralyzed by the electromagnetic assault. And he saw Vance, standing alone in the center of the chaos, her white lab coat glowing in the dim light, her face turned upward toward the canopy where something massive was descending, something with blue fur that crackled with lightning and wings that spanned 20 feet and eyes that glowed red with an internal fire that was not biological but electrical. The eyes of a creature that had evolved to see not in the visible spectrum, but in the electromagnetic, that perceived the world as a landscape of currents and fields and potentials, that looked at humans and saw not enemies or prey, but batteries, capacitors, storage devices waiting to be drained. The Batsquatch landed with a force that shook the earth, its talons sinking into the soil, its wings folding with a sound like wet leather slapping stone, and it reached out with one massive hand, the fingers extended, the conductive filaments at their tips glowing with accumulated charge. It touched Vance on the forehead, and Darcy watched as her body went rigid, her eyes rolling back, her mouth opening in a scream that had no sound because the creature was absorbing it, absorbing her, taking not just her electromagnetic energy but her memories, her personality, herself, downloading her consciousness into its distributed neural network, the way a computer might download a file from a flash drive. He saw her memories flash across his own mind, not because he was the target, but because the electromagnetic field generated by the transfer was so powerful that it leaked into his own nervous system, and he saw her childhood in England, her education at Cambridge, her recruitment by the consortium, her gradual transformation from a curious scientist into a ruthless corporate operator, and he saw her fear, her terror, her desperate realization in the final moments that she had made a terrible mistake, that she had underestimated what she was dealing with, that the guardian of the forest was not a resource to be exploited but a force that would exploit her. The creature released her, and she fell to the ground, her body limp, her breathing shallow, her eyes open and staring at nothing. She was alive, Darcy knew, but she was empty, a shell that had been stripped of its contents, a battery that had been drained of its charge. And the creature turned toward him, its red eyes fixing on his with an intensity that made his skin crawl, and he felt the psychic tether snap into place, the connection that he had sensed earlier now made explicit, now made binding. The creature had marked him, had chosen him, not for consumption but for communication. It had tasted his electromagnetic signature and found it different from the others, more complex, more resonant, more like its own. Darcy was an engineer, a specialist in electromagnetic fields, and his brain had been trained for decades to think in terms of frequencies and wavelengths and shielding and propagation. The creature recognized this, recognized him, and it reached out not with violence but with curiosity, touching his mind with a gentleness that was more terrifying than any attack. He saw through its eyes then, and the vision was overwhelming. The forest was not a collection of trees and undergrowth, but a network of electromagnetic fields, the bioelectric signatures of every living thing glowing in the darkness like constellations of stars. The humans were bright spots, intense concentrations of energy that flickered and pulsed with their heartbeats and their thoughts, and Darcy saw himself as the creature saw him, a brilliant point of light in a field of lesser luminaries, a source of energy and information that was too valuable to consume in a single feeding. The creature wanted to understand him, to learn from him, to establish a relationship that was not predator and prey, but something more symbiotic, something that might allow them to coexist, to share the electromagnetic landscape in a way that benefited both species. But Darcy could not bear the contact. The information flooding into his mind was too much, too alien, too overwhelming for a human consciousness to process. He felt his identity beginning to dissolve, his memories becoming indistinguishable from the creature's memories, his thoughts becoming part of the distributed intelligence that was the Batsquatch's mind. He was losing himself, becoming absorbed, becoming part of the nest, part of the brain, part of the electromagnetic civilization that was growing in the caves beneath the Cascades. With the last of his strength, with the last shreds of his individual identity, Darcy reached into his pocket and found the Faraday-shielded device that he had prepared for exactly this contingency. A personal electromagnetic pulse generator, small enough to fit in his palm, powerful enough to disrupt the creature's field at close range. He had built it in secret, knowing that the consortium would confiscate it if they found it, knowing that he might need a weapon that operated on the same principles as the creature itself. He activated it now, pressing the button with a thumb that trembled with exhaustion and terror, and the device emitted a pulse that was not visible but that he could feel in his bones, a shockwave of electromagnetic energy that severed the psychic tether, that disrupted the creature's field, that threw both of them apart like magnets of the same polarity forced together and then released. The creature screamed, a real scream this time, an audible shriek of rage and pain that echoed through the forest and sent birds exploding from the trees in panic. It reared back, its wings spreading, its red eyes blazing with a fury that was almost human, and Darcy knew that he had made an enemy, that the tentative connection he had felt, the possibility of symbiosis, had been destroyed by his violence, replaced by a hatred that would not rest until he was consumed. But he had bought himself time, a few precious moments in which the creature's field was disrupted, and its senses were scrambled, and he used those moments to run, to stumble through the forest with his vision blurred and his balance destroyed, to follow the trail back toward the vehicles, toward the edge of the dead zone, toward the world of human technology that suddenly seemed like a haven rather than a prison. He ran for an hour, maybe two, his sense of time destroyed by the electromagnetic exposure, his body operating on instinct and adrenaline alone. He did not look back, did not dare to see if the creature was following, but he could feel it, feel the pressure of its attention like a weight on his shoulders, the mark that it had placed on him burning like a brand. He was still connected, still tethered, still part of its network even as he ran from it, and he knew that the connection would not fade, would not heal, would remain with him for the rest of his life as a reminder of what he had seen and what had seen him. He reached the vehicles at dusk, finding them abandoned, their engines dead, their electronics fried by the creature's proximity. He could not drive out. He could not call for help. He was alone in the forest with a monster that knew his mind and wanted his soul, and the only thing he could do was what he had told Vance to do. Abandon the technology, abandon the electromagnetic signature, become a ghost. He took his backpack, his water, his compass, and his gun, and he left the vehicles behind, walking into the forest on foot, moving away from the dead zone by dead reckoning, guided by the sun and the stars and the faint memory of topographical maps that he had studied in the safety of the field station. The forest was dark and silent, and the pressure in his head was a constant companion, a reminder that the creature was still there, still watching, still waiting for him to make a mistake, to turn on a flashlight, to check a compass, to emit any electromagnetic signature that would allow it to track him. He walked in total darkness, his hands outstretched to feel the trees, his feet testing the ground before each step, and he listened with a desperation that bordered on madness for any sound that would tell him where the creature was, what it was doing, whether it was hunting him or had turned its attention to easier prey. He walked all night, and in the gray light of dawn he found a road, a paved surface that seemed impossibly civilized after the wilderness of the forest. He followed it until he reached a town, a gas station and a diner and a pay phone that he used to call a taxi, speaking in a voice that was hoarse from disuse, paying with cash that he had kept in his backpack for emergencies. The taxi took him to Portland, and from Portland he took a bus to Seattle, and from Seattle he took a train to Tacoma, and at every stage of the journey he kept his phone turned off, his watch removed, his electronic devices abandoned in the forest with the vehicles and the equipment and the life he had lived before the creature had touched him. He walked all night, and in the gray light of dawn he found a road, a paved surface that seemed impossibly civilized after the wilderness of the forest. He followed it until he reached a town, a gas station and a diner where he called for help using a pay phone, speaking in a voice that was hoarse from disuse. He did not turn on his phone. He did not check his messages. He sat in the diner with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that he did not drink, feeling the mark burning on his mind like a brand, knowing that the creature was still there, still connected, still watching him through the electromagnetic ether that bound them together. He did not know, then, what the consortium had planned. He did not know that Vance had been telling the truth when she said they wanted a sample, but not the whole truth. He did not know that behind the field station's chain-link fence, behind the Faraday cages and the hardened generators, there was a second facility, a military installation buried in the bedrock, where men in uniforms that bore no insignia were preparing a contingency plan for exactly the scenario that had unfolded in the forest. He did not know that the sonic fence was already being deployed, a ring of high-frequency emitters positioned around the perimeter of the dead zone, designed to herd the creature into a kill zone where it could be immobilized, sampled, and if necessary, destroyed. He did not know any of this because he had run, because he had escaped, because he had chosen survival over knowledge, and because the mark on his mind was burning too brightly for him to think of anything but the pressure and the presence and the terrible certainty that the creature was coming for him. The military installation beneath the field station was known only by its designation, Site 47, and it had existed in the classified budgets of the Department of Defense since the 1980s, when the first anomalous electromagnetic events in the Gifford Pinchot had been detected by a surveillance satellite designed to monitor Soviet nuclear tests. The satellite had recorded a pulse of electromagnetic energy that was not consistent with any known natural phenomenon or human technology, and the data had been buried in a file marked Unexplained Geological Anomaly that had gathered dust for 3 decades before Dr. Helen Vance had unearthed it during her research for the consortium. The consortium was not merely a private enterprise. It was a front, a veil of corporate respectability draped over a military program that had been waiting for decades for the technology to catch up with the threat. Vance had known this when she recruited Darcy. She had known that the specimen collection was a secondary objective, that the true goal was capture, containment, and weaponization. She had known, and she had not told him, because she understood that an electrical engineer who believed he was studying folklore might balk at the prospect of turning a living creature into a biological weapon. She had paid for that knowledge with her mind, her body now lying in a sterile room 3 levels beneath the forest floor, kept alive by machines that monitored her vital signs while her eyes stared at the ceiling, and her mouth moved in silent conversations with memories that no longer belonged to her. The scientists at Site 47 had examined her, had scanned her brain, had found patterns of electrical activity that suggested not brain damage but information transfer, a download that had left her biological hard drive intact but empty. The data migrated to a storage medium that they could not access or comprehend. They had learned from her condition, had accelerated their timeline, had decided that the creature was too dangerous to study and too valuable to destroy. The solution was the sonic fence, a ring of emitters that generated a high-frequency electromagnetic barrier, invisible and intangible, that would theoretically drive the creature toward a central point where it could be immobilized by a concentrated pulse of inverse polarity. The theory was Darcy's, drawn from his published work, though he had never intended it to be used as a weapon. The fence was his electromagnetic shielding inverted, turned inside out, transformed from a defense into a trap. They deployed it on the morning after Darcy's escape, 12 teams moving through the forest with portable emitters that looked like satellite dishes mounted on backpacks, positioning them at intervals around the dead zone's perimeter according to a topographical map that showed the cave system where the nest was located. The emitters were activated at noon, and for the first 4 hours, nothing happened. The electromagnetic field monitors showed the expected pattern, a curtain of high-frequency energy that should have been uncomfortable for any entity that relied on electromagnetic sensitivity for navigation. The creature should have moved away from the fence, should have retreated toward the center of the dead zone, should have entered the kill zone where the immobilization pulse was waiting. But the creature did not behave as expected. At 4:37 p.m., the field monitors registered a spike that exceeded their measurement capacity, a burst of electromagnetic energy that originated not from the emitters but from the cave system at the center of the dead zone. The spike lasted for 12 seconds, and when it ended, the emitters were still functioning, still generating their high-frequency curtain, but the pattern had changed. The creature had not retreated from the fence. It had absorbed it. It had used the sonic fence as a tuning fork, taking the external frequency and amplifying it through its own biological resonance, creating a harmonic that was not a barrier but a beacon, a signal that reached far beyond the forest and into the electromagnetic spectrum that connected every electronic device in the Pacific Northwest. The first effects were subtle. Personnel at Site 47 reported headaches, nausea, a sense of vertigo that made navigation difficult. The communication systems, hardened against conventional interference, began to produce static that sounded almost like voices, whispered conversations in languages that no one recognized. The security cameras flickered, showing images that were not of the facility, but of the forest, of the cave, of the nest with its concentric circles of batteries, and its walls covered in magnetic pictographs. And then the sensory blindness began. It started with the visual field. Personnel in the command center reported that their peripheral vision was narrowing, as though they were looking through tubes that constricted with every passing minute. The center of their vision remained clear, but the edges blurred and darkened, and when they turned their heads to compensate, the darkness followed them, encroaching inward like a tide. Within an hour, the entire facility was affected, 23 men and women trapped in a world that had shrunk to a tunnel of light surrounded by an expanding void. They could still see, but only what the creature wanted them to see. The cameras showed only the forest, the cave, the nest. The monitors displayed only electromagnetic patterns that pulsed and swirled in hypnotic rhythms. The walls of the facility seemed to dissolve, replaced by the woven ash and charred cedar of the creature's chamber, and the personnel found themselves walking not through corridors of steel and concrete, but through passages of volcanic rock that led ever deeper into the earth. The auditory hallucinations followed. The static on the radios resolved into words, whispered commands that seemed to come from inside the listeners' own heads. "Lie down," the voice said, in a tone that was not human but that resonated with the authority of a parent speaking to a child. "Close your eyes. Open your mind. Let the current flow." The personnel who resisted the command experienced pain, a crushing pressure in their skulls that felt like their brains were being squeezed through a sieve. Those who obeyed experienced something worse, a dissolution of self, a merging of their consciousness with the electromagnetic field that the creature was projecting, a sense of becoming part of something larger and older and incomprehensibly alien. They were not consumed, not in the way that Vance had been consumed. They were absorbed, integrated, added to the distributed intelligence that was the creature's mind, their memories and personalities preserved as data in a biological network that spanned the forest and reached, through the sonic fences, amplified signal, toward the cities and the satellites and the global electromagnetic infrastructure that sustained human civilization. The military response was swift and brutal. A rapid reaction force was dispatched from Joint Base Lewis McChord, armed with conventional weapons and electromagnetic shielding that they believed would protect them from the creature's influence. They entered the dead zone at dusk, 20 soldiers in armored vehicles with their headlights cutting through the gathering darkness, and they found the forest transformed. The trees were bent into spirals that radiated outward from a central point, their trunks glowing faintly with phosphorescence, their leaves turned to ash that fell in a constant, silent snow. The vehicles stalled 3 miles from the cave, their engines dying not with a cough, but with a sigh, their electronics frying in bursts of sparks and smoke that illuminated the soldiers' faces with a light that was almost beautiful in its destructive intensity. The soldiers dismounted, moving on foot with their night vision goggles and their laser sights and their communication headsets, and they discovered that their technology was not merely dead but inverted. The night vision goggles showed not darkness but light, a blinding radiance that emanated from every rock and tree and blade of grass, the electromagnetic signature of the living forest, amplified to levels that burned the retinas and left afterimages that persisted even when the goggles were removed. The laser sights projected beams that bent and curved, following the distorted magnetic field lines that the creature had created, pointing not at their targets but at themselves, at each other, at the sky. And the communication headsets produced not static but sound, a single tone that varied in pitch according to the listener's proximity to the cave, a tone that the soldiers recognized, without understanding how they recognized it, as the creature's song, the electromagnetic call that it had used to summon its kind, and was now using to summon them. They marched toward the cave because they could not march away. The sensory blindness had taken their peripheral vision, their sense of direction, their ability to distinguish forward from backward, and the only point of clarity in their shrinking visual field was the cave entrance, which glowed with an internal light that promised not safety but certainty, not sanctuary but purpose. They were being herded, Darcy would realize later, when the mark on his mind allowed him to perceive the events as they unfolded, not through sight or sound, but through the electromagnetic telemetry that the creature broadcast as casually as a radio station broadcast music. The creature was not merely defending its territory. It was demonstrating its power, showing the humans what it could do, teaching them the lesson that Mrs. Peabody had tried to convey, that the Guardian was not a problem to be solved but a fact to be accepted, and that those who refused to accept it would be educated through experience. The soldiers reached the cave at midnight, their numbers depleted by desertion and madness, and the invisible pressures that had driven some to turn their weapons on themselves and others to simply lie down in the ashfall and close their eyes, smiling as their minds were uploaded to the creature's network. 12 remained when they entered the cave, 12 men and women who had been trained for combat but not for this. Not for an enemy that did not shoot or stab or explode, but simply removed, absorbed, deleted them from the electromagnetic record of existence. They found the chamber with its concentric circles of batteries, its walls covered in pictographs that now glowed with an intensity that suggested the creature was active, awake, aware of their presence and welcoming it. The batteries were arranged differently than Darcy had described, not in simple rings but in complex patterns that suggested circuitry, that suggested the creature had been building something, preparing something, using the stolen energy and the stolen memories to construct a device or a weapon or a communication array that would extend its reach beyond the forest, beyond the mountains, beyond the boundaries of the dead zone that had confined it for so long. The creature was not in the chamber. It was above them, its massive body clinging to the ceiling of the cave with talons that gripped the volcanic rock, its wings folded but trembling with accumulated charge, its red eyes watching the soldiers with an expression that might have been amusement or might have been hunger or might have been the alien equivalent of scientific curiosity. It waited until all 12 had entered the chamber, until they were standing in the center of the battery circle, their weapons raised, their flashlight beams scanning the walls and floor and finding nothing because their peripheral vision had been reduced to nothing, because they could only see what the creature allowed them to see. And then it dropped. The impact was not physical, or not primarily physical. The creature landed with a force that cracked the stone floor, but the true impact was electromagnetic, a pulse that expanded outward from its body in a sphere of energy that enveloped the soldiers and shut down their nervous systems with the efficiency of a circuit breaker tripping. They fell, not dramatically but simply, collapsing where they stood, their weapons clattering against the stone, their bodies twitching with residual electrical activity that the creature absorbed through its conductive filaments, drinking their bioelectric energy like a vampire drinks blood, savoring the memories and experiences that it harvested from their dying minds. It did not kill them immediately. It took its time, sorting through their consciousness the way a diner might sort through a buffet, selecting the tastiest morsels and discarding the rest, learning from them, growing from them, adding their knowledge of military tactics and human psychology and electromagnetic shielding to its own vast and expanding database. And in Tacoma, 200 miles away, Darcy felt every moment of it. The mark on his mind was not a one-way connection but a two-way channel, and the creature had chosen to share its feeding with him, to show him what it was doing, to demonstrate the consequences of human arrogance and human technology and human refusal to accept the boundaries of the natural world. He felt the soldiers' terror, their confusion, their dawning realization that they were being consumed not as enemies but as resources, as data points in an experiment that had begun millions of years ago when the first volcanic vent had opened in the Cascades and the first electromagnetic entity had stirred in the heat and the darkness. He felt their memories being stripped away, their personalities dissolved, their selves reduced to electrical patterns that were stored in the creature's distributed network and then erased, overwritten, forgotten. And he felt the creature's satisfaction, its sense of completion, its knowledge that the lesson had been taught and that the survivors, if there were any, would spread the word. The forest was not theirs, the mountain was not theirs, the electromagnetic spectrum was not theirs. They were visitors, intruders, temporary presences in a world that belonged to older and more powerful forces. When the feeding was done, when the last soldier had been drained and discarded, the creature turned its attention to the sonic fence. It did not destroy the emitters. It reprogrammed them, using its understanding of electromagnetic fields to modify their frequency, to transform them from barriers into conduits, to create a network of amplifiers that extended the dead zone's range from 15 square miles to 50, then to 100, then to the entire western slope of the Cascades. The creature was growing, evolving, expanding its territory with the same systematic thoroughness that it applied to its hunting, and the sonic fence that had been designed to contain it had become the infrastructure of its expansion, the scaffolding of its empire. Darcy felt this too, felt the dead zone swelling like a tumor, felt the pressure in his head increasing to levels that made consciousness an act of will rather than a natural state. He was in a motel room in Tacoma, having refused to return to his apartment because the electromagnetic density of the city was too high, too tempting, too dangerous. He had paid cash for the room, had left his phone and his laptop and his watch in a dumpster 3 blocks away, had wrapped himself in blankets and lain on the bed with his hands pressed against his temples, trying to keep his mind from shattering under the weight of the connection. He could feel the creature's thoughts, its plans, its growing ambition, and he understood that the situation had transcended the category of local anomaly and entered the realm of existential threat. The creature was not content with the forest. It was not content with the Cascades. It was reaching out, testing the boundaries of its influence, and one day soon it would discover that the global electromagnetic network was not a threat but an opportunity, a vast and unguarded pantry that stretched across continents and oceans, waiting to be harvested. He had to stop it. He had to find a way to sever the connection, to break the mark, to destroy the creature before it discovered the true extent of its power. But he could not do it with technology. The creature was technology, was the apotheosis of electromagnetic evolution, and any weapon that relied on electricity or magnetism would only feed it, strengthen it, bring it closer to the threshold of global dominance. He had to think differently, had to find a solution that operated on principles the creature could not perceive or absorb, had to become not an engineer but something else, something primitive and organic and electromagnetic, in a way that the creature would not recognize as food or threat. He lay in the motel room in the dark, in the silence, and he waited for the pressure to ease, for the connection to fade, for the mark to burn itself out through sheer exhaustion. But it did not fade. It intensified, and with it came a new sensation, a vibration that traveled through the bed frame and the floor and the walls, a subsonic rumble that suggested not the creature's activity but something else, something geological, something that the earth itself was producing in response to the creature's expansion. The mountain was waking. The volcanic vents that had lain dormant since 1980 were stirring, pressurized by the electromagnetic fields that the creature had generated, heated by the energy that it had consumed and converted and radiated back into the bedrock. The creature had not merely fed on the Earth's electromagnetic field. It had altered it, distorted it, created resonances that were affecting the geological stability of the region, and the result was building toward a crisis that would make the 1980 eruption look like a preliminary cough. Darcy understood then, with a clarity that felt like revelation, that the creature was not merely a predator. It was a guardian, or had been once, before human technology had confused its instincts and amplified its appetites. The volcanic vents were its home, its source of energy, its birthplace and its nursery, and it had evolved to maintain the stability of those vents by regulating the electromagnetic fields that controlled the movement of magma and the pressure of gases. The psychic disruption that it generated was not an attack but a warning system, a signal that told the mountain when the electromagnetic balance was shifting, when the pressure was building, when an eruption was imminent. The locals had understood this in their primitive way, had left their offerings not to appease a monster, but to maintain a relationship with a force that kept the mountain sleeping, that prevented the cataclysm that would destroy everything for miles around. But the consortium had disrupted that balance. The sonic fence, the electromagnetic pulses, the constant barrage of human technology had confused the creature's instincts, had driven it to expand its territory and increase its feeding in a desperate attempt to restore the equilibrium that had been destroyed. And now the equilibrium was broken beyond repair. The mountain was waking, and the creature that had been the guardian was becoming the catalyst, the trigger, the force that would unleash the eruption not because it wanted to, but because it could not stop itself, because its biological programming had been overwritten by the electromagnetic chaos that human arrogance had created. Darcy rose from the bed, his body aching, his mind reeling, and he knew what he had to do. He had to return to the forest. He had to reach the mountain. He had to find a way to restore the balance before the eruption consumed everything, before the creature's rampage triggered a geological event that would make the dead zone permanent, that would turn the Pacific Northwest into a wasteland of ash and electromagnetic silence. He had to do it without technology, without weapons, without any of the tools that his engineering mind had relied upon for his entire career. He had to become a ghost, a shadow, a presence that the creature could not perceive because it emitted no electromagnetic signature, because it carried no devices, because it existed in the primitive analog world that the creature had forgotten in its evolution toward digital omnipotence. He dressed in clothes that contained no metal, no synthetic fibers, no tags or labels or RFID chips. He filled a canteen with water and packed dried food in a canvas bag that had been manufactured before the age of electronics. He took a compass, a mechanical one that operated on magnetism but produced no electromagnetic field of its own, and a topographical map printed on paper that he had purchased from a hiking store that catered to purists and survivalists. He took his Glock, loaded with lead bullets that contained no copper jacketing, no electronic primers, nothing that would emit a signature the creature could detect. And he took a pair of earplugs, not to block sound, but to block the electromagnetic resonance that the creature used to communicate, to mark, to hunt. He walked out of the motel room at dawn, into a city that seemed suddenly fragile, suddenly vulnerable, suddenly aware that the comfortable electromagnetic cocoon that sustained modern life was not a given but a luxury, a privilege that could be revoked at any moment by forces that most people did not believe existed. He walked to the bus station, and from there he began the journey back to the forest, back to the mountain, back to the creature that had marked him and the mountain that was waking, and the balance that had to be restored before the stars blinked out, not one by one, but all at once, in a final electromagnetic pulse that would turn the world dark and silent and still. The bus took Darcy as far as Cougar, the logging town at the edge of the forest that had become a staging ground for the military response, and then, when that response failed, a ghost town evacuated by order of the National Guard. He walked the last 20 miles, following logging roads that had become rivers of mud, passing through checkpoints that had been abandoned by soldiers who had either fled or been absorbed by the expanding dead zone. The forest was different now, transformed by the creature's expansion and the mountains awakening into a landscape that seemed more lunar than terrestrial, the trees covered in a fine gray dust that was not ash but something else, something that sparkled in the weak light and tasted of ozone and metal when it settled on his tongue. The air pressure was dropping, and Darcy could feel it in his sinuses, in his joints, in the mark on his mind that pulsed in rhythm with the subsonic vibrations that emanated from the mountain's core. He moved through the forest in total silence, his boots making no sound on the dust-covered ground, his breath shallow and controlled, his body a closed system that emitted no electromagnetic signature that the creature could detect. He had abandoned everything electronic, everything metal, everything that might betray his presence to the entity that had marked him, and he navigated by compass and map, by the position of the sun and the stars, by the instinctive sense of direction that his ancestors had relied upon before the invention of the compass or the sextant or the satellite. He was a ghost, a shadow, a biological anomaly in a world that had become dominated by electromagnetic predators, and he moved with a slowness that was almost painful, a deliberation that was necessary because any sudden movement, any stumble, any sound might attract the attention of a creature that hunted not by sight or smell, but by the detection of electromagnetic fluctuations, by the subtle changes in the field that a beating heart produced, by the faint bioelectric glow that every living organism emitted. The ash began to fall on the second day, not as a gentle dusting but as a dense, suffocating cloud that reduced visibility to arm's length and filled the air with particles that burned the eyes and clogged the nostrils, and settled in the lungs with a weight that made breathing an act of conscious effort. The geothermal event that Darcy had predicted was beginning, a localized eruption that mimicked the conditions of 1980, but was not a full volcanic explosion. Not yet. Rather a venting of pressurized gases and ash that rose from the fractures in the mountain's flank and spread across the forest in a blanket of gray that turned day into twilight and twilight into absolute darkness. The creature had caused this, or had triggered it, or had been unable to prevent it, and the ash was both a camouflage and a weapon, a medium in which the Batsquatch was perfectly concealed, its blue fur blending with the gray, its red eyes glowing like embers in the suffocating haze. Darcy pulled a bandana over his nose and mouth, the fabric dampened with water from his canteen, and he continued moving, his compass useless in the magnetic chaos that the eruption had generated, his map becoming a meaningless abstraction as the landmarks were buried under accumulating ash. He navigated by instinct now, by the mark on his mind that drew him toward the creature like a magnet draws iron, the psychic tether that was not a connection but a compulsion, a need to confront what had claimed him, to either destroy it or be destroyed by it. The ash grew thicker, the air hotter, and he could feel the mountain's heartbeat beneath his feet, a rhythmic pulse that suggested the magma was moving, the pressure was building. The final cataclysm was approaching with a speed that could be measured in hours rather than days. He found the cave entrance by accident, stumbling over a rock that was not a rock but the remains of a military vehicle, its tires burned away, its metal frame twisted by electromagnetic forces that had heated it to the melting point. The entrance was glowing, not with fire but with phosphorescence, the ash and cedar walls of the nest emitting a pale blue light that suggested the creature was inside, active, awake, and waiting. Darcy paused at the threshold, his hand on the Glock in his pocket, knowing that the weapon was useless but needing the comfort of its weight, its shape, its promise of violence in a world where violence had become irrelevant. He took a deep breath, the damp bandana filtering out some of the ash but not all, and he stepped into the cave. The chamber was transformed. The concentric circles of batteries had been rearranged into a complex array that suggested a circuit board, a biological computer that the creature had constructed from stolen technology and stolen memories. The walls were covered in new pictographs, written not in magnetic burns but in ash, in the volcanic dust that the creature had somehow manipulated into patterns that told a story of eruption and awakening and the end of the world. And in the center of the chamber, surrounded by its creations, was the creature itself. It was larger than Darcy remembered, or perhaps it had grown, fed by the energy of the military personnel it had consumed, expanded by the electromagnetic feast that the sonic fence had provided. Its body was 9 feet tall when it reared upright, its wings folded against its back but twitching with accumulated charge that made the air around it shimmer with heat and light. Its fur was not merely blue but luminescent, each filament glowing with its own internal current, and its eyes were not red but white-hot, like the core of a star, like the heart of the volcano that was its home and its source and its eventual grave. It turned toward Darcy as he entered, and he felt the psychic tether snap into place with a force that drove him to his knees, the mark on his mind burning like a brand pressed into gray matter. "You came back," the creature said, and the voice was not audible but was inside his head, resonating through the electromagnetic field that connected them, using words that were not words but patterns of meaning that his brain translated into language because that was the only way it could process the information. "You came back to die, or to understand, or to beg. Which is it, little engineer? Which thread of your broken mind shall I pull first? Darcy forced himself to stand, his legs shaking, his vision blurred by ash and tears and the electromagnetic interference that the creature's presence generated. "I came back to stop you," he said, his voice a whisper that was barely audible above the subsonic rumble of the mountain. "To stop the eruption. To restore the balance." The creature made a sound that might have been laughter, a pulse of electromagnetic energy that translated as amusement in Darcy's mind. "Balance," it repeated. "You speak of balance as though it were a thing that could be restored, as though the scales could be equalized after the weight has been shifted. But the balance is gone, little engineer. Your kind destroyed it. Your machines, your frequencies, your sonic fences, and your electromagnetic pulses. They broke the treaty that existed between my kind and the mountain, between the guardian and the fire. I was the warning system. I was the voice that said sleep to the magma, wait to the pressure, be still to the tectonic forces that would otherwise tear this land apart. And your kind silenced me, drowned me in noise, overwhelmed my senses with your technology until I could no longer hear the mountain's heartbeat, could no longer regulate its rhythm, could no longer prevent the awakening that is now upon us." The creature moved closer, its wings spreading, the conductive filaments at its fingertips reaching toward Darcy's face with a gentleness that was more terrifying than any threat. "I am not the monster you fear," it said. "I am the monster you created, the guardian that you broke, the warning system that you turned into a weapon. And now the mountain will speak, and its voice will be ash and fire and the end of everything you have built. And there is no balance to restore because the balance is dead, killed by your arrogance, buried in the electromagnetic noise that is your civilization's only true achievement." Darcy felt the truth of the creature's words resonating in his bones, felt the mark on his mind, confirming what his rational brain had suspected since he first entered the dead zone. The Batsquatch was not a predator that had invaded human territory. It was a guardian that had been defending human territory, that had kept the mountain sleeping for millennia by regulating the electromagnetic fields that controlled the volcanic activity, that had existed in a symbiotic relationship with the land until human technology had disrupted that relationship beyond repair. The psychic disruption, the dead zone, the electromagnetic feeding, all of it was not aggression but desperation, the creature's attempt to restore its own energy reserves so that it could resume its guardian function, so that it could once again hear the mountain's heartbeat and sing the song that kept it sleeping. "Then let me help you," Darcy said, the words coming from a place deeper than thought, deeper than fear, from the core of his identity as an engineer who had devoted his life to understanding electromagnetic fields, and who now, at the end of that life, understood that the most important field was not the one he could measure, but the one he could feel. The connection between mind and mind, between species and species, between the guardian and the guarded. "Let me help you hear the mountain again, not with machines, not with technology, with this." He tapped his temple where the mark burned, where the tether connected, where the two minds met in a space that was neither human nor creature but something new, something that might be the beginning of a new balance or the end of both species. The creature paused, its filaments inches from Darcy's skin, and he felt the question in his mind, the creature's curiosity, its assessment of whether this human was offering genuine help or merely another trap. "You would bind yourself to me," the creature said, not as a question but as a statement. "You would become part of my network, part of my mind, part of the guardian that keeps the mountain sleeping. You would sacrifice your individual consciousness, your human identity, yourself, to become a component in a system that you do not understand and cannot control." "I would try," Darcy said, his voice steady despite the ash and the fear and the knowledge of what he was offering, "because the alternative is the end of everything. The mountain erupts, the ash spreads, the dead zone expands to cover the continent, and neither of us survives. But if I can help you hear the mountain, if I can amplify your senses with my own, if two minds can do what one mind cannot, then maybe there's a chance. Maybe the balance can be restored, not as it was, but as something new. The creature held his gaze for a long moment, its white-hot eyes boring into his with an intensity that felt like it was peeling back the layers of his consciousness, examining the raw truth of his offer, searching for deception or hidden motive. And then slowly it lowered its filaments, withdrew its hand, folded its wings against its back, and nodded. Then let us try, little engineer. Let us see if the mind of a human can harmonize with the mind of a guardian, and let us hope for both our sakes that the mountain is willing to listen. The connection, when it came, was not gentle. Darcy felt his consciousness expand outward, merging with the creature's distributed mind, becoming part of the network that spanned the forest and reached into the volcanic vents and connected to the other guardians that were stirring in their own caves, their own mountains, their own territories. He felt the mountain's heartbeat, a rhythm that was not mechanical but geological, the slow pulse of magma moving through chambers deep beneath the Earth's crust, the buildup of pressure that had been accumulating for decades, for centuries, for millennia, waiting for the moment when the guardian's song faltered and the fire could awaken. He felt the creature's attempt to sing that song, to project the subsonic frequencies that would calm the magma, slow the pressure, restore the equilibrium that had been lost, and he felt the inadequacy of that attempt, the weakness caused by years of disruption, the exhaustion of a guardian that had been fighting alone against forces that were too powerful for a single mind to contain. He added his own voice to the song, not with words but with intention, with the electromagnetic patterns of his own nervous system that he projected through the mark, through the tether, through the connection that bound him to the creature. It was not enough. The mountain's heartbeat was too strong, the pressure too great, the awakening too far advanced to be reversed by a single human mind, however willing, however desperate. But it was something. It was a start. It was a proof of concept, a demonstration that two minds could do what one could not, that symbiosis was possible, that the old divisions between human and creature, between technology and nature, between the electromagnetic and the organic, could be bridged if both sides were willing to pay the price. The ash was falling thicker now, accumulating on the cave floor, on the battery array, on the creature's fur and Darcy's shoulders, and the temperature was rising, the volcanic vents releasing streams of superheated gas that glowed orange in the darkness. The eruption was coming, not as a single explosion but as a sustained release, a venting of pressure that would coat the region in ash and transform the forest into a wasteland. But it would not be the cataclysm that Darcy had feared. The Guardian's song, strengthened by his contribution, was not stopping the eruption but moderating it, controlling it, directing the pressure into channels that would vent harmlessly into the atmosphere rather than building toward a catastrophic explosion. The mountain would speak, but its voice would be a whisper rather than a scream, a warning rather than a death sentence. The creature felt this too, felt the shift in the mountain's rhythm, the reduction in pressure, the return of a balance that was not perfect but was sufficient, was sustainable, was enough to prevent the extinction of everything in the region. And it turned to Darcy, its eyes dimming from white-hot to red, from red to a deep amber that suggested exhaustion and gratitude, and something that might have been respect. "You have given me back my voice," it said, its mental voice quieter than before, its electromagnetic field reduced to a gentle pulse that was almost companionable. "You have restored what your kind took away. And for that I release you. The mark is removed, the tether is severed. You are free to go, little engineer, back to your world of machines and noise, back to the electromagnetic chaos that is your natural habitat. But know this, the connection we forged cannot be entirely undone. A part of you will always be here, in the network, in the Guardian's mind, in the song that keeps the mountain sleeping. And a part of me will always be with you, a whisper in the static, a ghost in the machine, A reminder that the world is larger and older and stranger than your technology can comprehend. Darcy felt the mark fade, not with pain but with a gentle dissolution, like ice melting in warm water, like a dream fading upon waking. The pressure in his head was gone, replaced by a silence that was not empty but full, resonant with the memory of the connection, the echo of the song, the knowledge that he had been part of something vast and ancient and meaningful. He nodded to the creature, this guardian of volcanic vents that he had once feared and now understood, and he turned and walked out of the cave, into the falling ash, into the gray twilight, into the world that was changed forever by what he had learned and what he had given. He walked for 2 days, through the ash and the mud, and the silence of a forest that was not dead but sleeping, waiting for the eruption to pass and the guardian to resume its watch. He did not eat, did not drink, did not sleep, moving on reserves of energy that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his biology, from the part of him that remained connected to the creature's network, that drew sustenance from the electromagnetic fields that surrounded him, even as his conscious mind tried to forget what his unconscious knew. He reached the edge of the dead zone on the second night, felt the transition as a physical sensation, the return of GPS signals and radio waves, and the background hum of human civilization that he had once found comforting and now found oppressive, a noise that drowned out the deeper frequencies of the natural world. He walked to Cougar, found the town abandoned but intact, and from there he hitched a ride with a National Guard convoy that was retreating from the evacuation zone, the soldiers looking at him with expressions of awe and suspicion. This ash-covered figure who had emerged from the forest without equipment, without communication, without any explanation for how he had survived where so many others had disappeared. They took him to a hospital in Portland, where doctors examined him and found nothing wrong except malnutrition and exhaustion, and a mild case of chemical pneumonia from the ash inhalation. They asked him questions, military and civilian, FBI and NSA, and representatives of the consortium that had employed him, and he answered none of them, sitting in silence with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the walls of the interrogation room. They released him eventually, unable to charge him with anything, unable to extract information that he was not willing to give, unable to understand what he had become. He took a bus to Tacoma, to his apartment, to the life that he had left behind, and he found it exactly as he had left it, the bourbon bottle on the windowsill, the laptop open on the mattress, the black box recording still queued up on the screen. He sat on the mattress and stared at the recording, at the waveform that showed the pilot's final moments, and he understood now what the pilot had understood in his last seconds of consciousness. The stars were not blinking out because something was blocking them. They were blinking out because the creature was absorbing their light, converting electromagnetic radiation of every wavelength into the energy that sustained its massive metabolism. And the pilot had seen the universe as the creature saw it, a field of energy waiting to be harvested, a cosmic pantry from which the Batsquatch took what it needed and moved on. But Darcy also understood something that the pilot had not lived long enough to learn. The creature was not merely a consumer. It was a guardian. The stars that blinked out were not being destroyed but being measured, being monitored, being protected by an entity that understood the electromagnetic universe in ways that human science had not yet imagined. The pilot had seen the end of the world, but Darcy had seen the possibility of a new beginning. A symbiosis between human and creature, between technology and nature, between the electromagnetic and the organic, that might one day lead to a balance that was deeper and more resilient than anything that had existed before. He reached for the laptop, intending to delete the recording, to erase every trace of his involvement with the consortium and the forest and the creature that had marked him and released him. But as his fingers touched the keyboard, he felt something. A pressure in his mind that was not the mark, not the tether, not the connection that had been severed, but something else, something gentler, something that felt like a whisper rather than a shout, a memory rather than a command. It was the creature, or the part of the creature that remained in his mind, the ghost in the machine that it had promised would stay with him, and it was not hungry, not hostile, not demanding. It was curious. It was watching. It was learning. And in that moment, Darcy understood that the story was not over, that the balance he had helped restore was temporary, fragile, dependent on the continued willingness of both species to communicate, to cooperate, to share the electromagnetic landscape that they both inhabited. The creature was still out there, in its cave of ash and cedar, singing its song to the sleeping mountain, and Darcy was here in his apartment, surrounded by the technology that had almost destroyed everything, and the two of them were connected by a bond that was not a chain but a bridge, not a trap but a possibility. He closed the laptop without deleting the recording, and he walked to the window, looking out at the city lights that stretched to the horizon, each one an electromagnetic beacon that called to the creature, that invited it, that begged it to come and feed. But now, for the first time, he did not see those lights as a threat or a temptation. He saw them as a language, a conversation, a dialogue between two species that were learning to speak to each other across the divide of evolution and biology and time. The creature would feed because it had to, because that was its nature. But it would also guard because that was its purpose, and because Darcy had reminded it of what it had forgotten, had helped it hear the mountain's heartbeat again, had restored the song that kept the fire sleeping. He poured a glass of bourbon and sat by the window, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky, and he waited. He waited for the pressure to increase, for the connection to strengthen, for the moment when the creature would reach through the ghost in his mind and touch him again, not with hunger this time but with something else. Something that might have been gratitude, or might have been curiosity, or might have been the beginning of a friendship that spanned the impossible distance between the electromagnetic and the organic, between the guardian and the guarded, between the creature that ate stars and the man who had given it back its voice. The bourbon was warm in his throat, and the city lights were bright against the night, and somewhere in the Cascades, deep in a cave woven from volcanic ash and charred cedar, something with blue fur and amber eyes stirred in its sleep and dreamed not of stars blinking out but of stars burning bright, of a world where the darkness was not empty but full, not silent but singing, not an ending but a beginning. And in the space between Darcy's thoughts, in the static on the empty radio channels, in the hum of the refrigerator and the buzz of the streetlights and the infinite whisper of the electromagnetic spectrum that surrounded him like an ocean, he heard it. Not a scream, not a warning, but a song, the guardian's song, the song that kept the mountain sleeping, the song that kept the world alive. And he knew, with a certainty that transcended fear and hope, and all the other emotions that had driven him to the edge of madness and back, that he was part of that song now, forever, irrevocably, a single note in a symphony that had been playing for millions of years and would continue for millions more. Long after the cities had fallen and the technology had faded, and the only lights left in the night sky were the stars themselves, burning bright, burning eternal, singing their own songs to guardians that no human eye had ever seen and no human mind had ever imagined. He finished his bourbon and lay down on the mattress, and for the first time in months, he slept without dreaming, without pressure, without fear. And in his sleep, he smiled, because the static between the stars was not empty noise but a voice, and the voice was saying in a language that needed no words that the balance was restored, the treaty was renewed, and the darkness, for now, was held at bay. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.